In the early 1990s, the producers of Highlander agreed to make a sequel to a 1986 film that had only ever been planned as a one-off. But when money talks, nonsensical sequels walk. Or something. And Highlander II The Quickening didn't just walk, it ran headfirst into infamy as one of the most bewildering follow-ups ever made. A sequel that defied all logic, eventually sucking everything you knew about the original film into a black hole of nonsense. When the highlight of a movie is a resurrected Sean Connery going suit shopping, you know you're in trouble. Yet somehow, this wasn't the end for that franchise, it was only the beginning. And that's what makes exploring Hollywood's often disastrous attempts to follow up hit movies so fascinating. Just like a box of chocolates or a night out with Stanley Ipkiss, you never quite know what you're going to get. This year's Sequelpalooza has taken us through numerous flaming cinematic tire fires, a few nostalgia-fueled revivals, and even some surprisingly watchable follow-up installments. So now, as we close out 2025, it's time to revisit the journey. This is the second Sequelpalooza Megamix, a high-kicking, fruit-chopping, scream-laughing look at some of the wildest, weirdest, most disastrous sequels ever made, and the successful first films that made them possible. We've got more than 3 hours of Sequelpalooza goodness coming up, so welcome aboard, grab yourself a rum punch, and get settled in. And we're kicking off tonight's collection with an unexpected blockbuster from one of the biggest stars of the 90s, and the notorious sequel it eventually spawned more than a decade later. Have you ever finished watching a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And today, in the year of the 20th anniversary of the release of one of Hollywood's most disliked sequels, we're hurtling headfirst into the belly of the beast, Son of the Mask. In 1994, The Mask became an unexpected blockbuster, helping to take Jim Carrey from just another comedian to a gold-plated superstar, and introducing the world to Cameron Diaz. A sequel was inevitable, but it's mind-bending to attempt to understand how they got that follow-up so wrong. More than a decade on from the smash hit original, Son of the Mask replaced Carrey with Jamie Kennedy and completely tanked the series, delivering a critical and commercial disaster considered amongst the worst major studio films ever made. Where exactly does the blame lie for Son of the Mask becoming such an iconic example of follow-up film excess? Was Jim Carrey's 1994 run actually amongst the best single years any movie star has ever managed? And how bad does the reaction to a film have to be for its star to make a feature-length documentary about it?
She's right, man. It's Sunday. Get noticed. I'll be in the car.
Ooh, somebody should have stopped them. This is Sequelpalooza. As the world headed into the sweltering heat of the summer of '94, the USA hosted the World Cup for the very first time, bringing with it huge TV audiences and some very poorly taken opening ceremony penalty kicks. Meanwhile, on TV, Seinfeld, Home Improvement and The X-Files had been dominating screens for the first half of the year, and Friends and ER were both waiting in the wings to debut in September. The passing of Kurt Cobain in April had been huge news in the music world, and although grunge was still popular, hip-hop and R&B were beginning to take an ever-increasing grip on the charts. It wasn't all cool though. The biggest song of the summer was that future school disco slow dance favourite, I Swear, by All For One. At the cinema, The Lion King was becoming the peak of the Disney Renaissance and would be the year's highest grossing movie, closely followed by Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump, another huge hit. A major cultural phenomenon would be unveiled at the Cannes Film Festival in May, when a video store manager turned director's second film took home the Palme d'Or. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction would have a huge impact across the movie business after it was rolled out to cinemas in October. A more reserved revelation had arrived in March, when a small-budgeted British comedy called Four Weddings and a Funeral had also stunned Hollywood, going on to make over $245 million in cinemas. Another very different type of comedy proved an unexpected smash hit in early '94, introducing the wider world to Jim Carrey. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective had taken him from a Canadian comedian known by some as a cast member of the TV show In Living Color to one of Hollywood's hottest stars. Grossing more than $107 million in cinemas, it had also gone on to sell over 4 million VHS copies in its first 3 weeks on release. A vital stat for an industry increasingly valuing the long tail provided by video sales. Watching this unfold were the no doubt delighted producers of Carey's follow-up movie, a film which had been made in late 1993 when he was still an unknown cinematic quantity. The fact that he had proved you could carry a movie to major success was fantastic news for upstart studio New Line Cinema, the studio behind Carey's second movie of 1994, The Mask. Although I had no concept of this in my mid-90s youth, it began life as a comic book character which had first appeared in various forms in the 1980s before being reworked into a standalone series for Dark Horse Comics in 1989. Darker than the movie, it would eventually inspire discussions between Dark Horse founder Mike Richardson and various Hollywood studios about turning the horror comedy comic into its own movie had taken place before New Line gave the film the green light to go into production in late 1992, under director Chuck Russell. Russell had seemed an obvious choice for New Line, given they had envisaged The Mask as the start of a new horror franchise, and he had directed both A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and the remake of The Blob in the late 80s. But their chosen director, who had also written 1984's highly underrated Dreamscape, surprised them by electing to take The Mask in a less horror-tinged direction. New Line was looking at The Mask as a low-budget horror franchise, but I felt it could be much more than that. The original comic was very dark and violent, but I saw the potential for a wild, fun, and visually inventive film instead. So Russell worked with screenwriter Mike Werb to shape The Mask into something new, dialing down the ultra-violence and allowing it to become, in Russell's words, something that combined Tex Avery-style cartoon physics with live action. To make this a reality, aside from groundbreaking special effects from Industrial Light and Magic, it wouldn't be possible to deliver without the right leading man. Numerous established names were either discussed or considered for the lead role, from Robin Williams to Martin Short and Matthew Broderick to Nicolas Cage. But Russell had seen Jim Carrey's comedy live in person and considered him the perfect choice for the role. He even ensured that the script was crafted specifically to make the most of Carrey's physical comedy skills. That script told the story of Carrey's character Stanley Ipkiss, a bank clerk who gets bullied by basically everyone. His life is changed forever when he discovers a wooden mask which transforms him into his yellow-suited, green-faced alter ego, The Mask, bestowed with magical powers and ready to cause some mischief. Embracing his newfound confidence and capabilities, Stanley uses The Mask to turn his life around, partying and getting revenge on those who've wronged him. But he soon attracts the attention of the police, as well as a local mobster who wants The Mask for himself. and his girlfriend, club singer Tina, who both versions of Stanley have fallen for. As the chaos escalates, Stanley needs to work out whether he can face his problems, with or without the mask. The cast was filled out by the likes of Peter Riger and Amy Yazbek as a police officer and reporter on the trail of the mask, with Peter Green as the ambitious gangster. For the key role of Tina and Stanley's love interest, the original choice was Anna Nicole Smith, but she bailed last minute to make Naked Gun 33 1/3 instead. In the end, the part went to 21-year-old model Cameron Diaz in her very first film role. Sometimes in life things work out for the best, and this, despite Diaz only taking acting lessons after she got the job, was definitely one of those times. With the cast in place, The Mask went into production, with filming commencing in August and wrapping in October of 1993 across Los Angeles. The special effects work by ILM and Dream Quest Images were a pretty revolutionary blend of live action and CGI to create exaggerated, cartoonish visuals. ILM told Russell that Carey's ability to create uniquely expressive and elasticated facial expressions reduced the overall effects budget by around $1 million. The star would spend around 4 hours a day in makeup alone, with a costume that included fake teeth that Carey was supposed to take out for dialogue. Showing his dedication to the role, he managed to learn to wear them whilst talking anyway. The film working would be absolutely dictated by the relationship between Carey and the visual effects, and thankfully, rather than looking awkward, it ended up pretty magical. It was rightly nominated for a Best Visual Effects Oscar and still looks impressive today, more than 30 years on. Early test screenings for The Mask reportedly went well, and New Line execs, along with producer Bob Engelman, who had recently overseen films like Mr. Nanny starring Hulk Hogan and Revenge of the Nerds 3, began to realise they might have a surprise hit on their hands. Critical reaction was pretty positive too, if not overwhelmingly so. Though its groundbreaking effects and Carey's performance were generally acknowledged across the board, the New York Times called it an astonishingly lazy and perfunctory effort, and the Chicago Reader noted that the results are easy to watch, though awfully familiar and simple-minded. Some critics got it though, and both Siskel and Ebert were praising of the film's pretty undeniable charms.
Jim Carrey, he of the annoying overbite, is back in action as the Mask, and I have to admit it, I enjoyed a lot of this film.
We didn't like Ace Ventura, and so you probably walked into this movie with a kind of a negative attitude, and maybe I don't.
As a matter of fact, I don't.
I feel that Jim Carrey is extremely important to the success of this movie, and that somebody else in that character might not have done as good a job. And you give credit to everyone, to special effects, to Cameron Diaz, who was beautiful, to the dog, who was very funny. Why not give some credit to the guy who plays the title role?
As soon as it hit cinemas on July 29th, 1994, audiences made The Mask a movie sensation. Though its debut at the #1 spot only lasted 1 week, knocked off the top in its second week by the release of Clear and Present Danger, it would remain in North American cinemas for the rest of the year, and as it was rolled out across the world, continued to build momentum, eventually pulling in over $351 million at the worldwide box office. It would be the 4th highest grossing film of 1994. Not bad for a film with an $18 million budget from a horror franchise director who hadn't released a movie in cinemas in years. Sometimes in life, timing is everything. Carey, who had been established with Ace Ventura, was instantly sent to another level of fame. Diaz, from her very first role, was a household name. Russell had directed a legitimate blockbuster movie. And New Line Cinema, which had been bought by Turner for $500 million in January of '94, thought they had a brand new money-printing franchise on their hands. The Mask became part of the zeitgeist, with its dialogue and aesthetic regularly referenced across pop culture. The film connected in a way nobody could have been confident it would. A sequel was inevitable. The only problem was, their newly minted superstar made it clear he didn't want anything to do with a follow-up, telling Barbara Walters on network TV in early 1995 that he had been offered $10 million flat to return to the sequel, just a slight increase on the sub $500,000 he had received for the original, but in the end, deciding to pass on the project. Aside from anything else, Carey turning New Line down ruined an already launched Nintendo Power Magazine contest to win a walk-on part in The Mask 2. How could you, Jim? Everything was okay though, right? New Line really wanted a sequel, and even if Carrey might not agree to make it, the second Mask film couldn't turn out that badly, could it? Could it? Hello? Whisper it, but was Jim Carrey's 1994 one of the best years an actor has ever had in Hollywood? Or possibly even the best? Sounds crazy, but I think you could definitely argue the case for it. Sure, details can be debated until the cows come home, but from a standing start for a largely unknown name, it must be a contender. I mean, he didn't just have one hit, he backed it up straight away with two more, even bigger ones. Carrey started 1994 with Ace Ventura in February, followed it with The Mask in July, and ended it with Dumb and Dumber in December. These three films alone made more than $700 million in 1994's cinemas and became instant smashes on video as well, with all three spawning Carrey-less animated series the following year. To top that all off, before the release of Dumb and Dumber, he'd been offered $20 million to take on the role of the Riddler in Batman Forever in 1995. In January of '94, he had essentially been unknown to most mainstream audiences, seen by a small percentage of viewers in the likes of In Living Color and Earth Girls Are Easy. In double quick time though, he was not just a popular comedian, but one of the most famous and bankable actors in Hollywood. An unbelievable rise in such a short time, but one which was absolutely backed up by the data. Where would you say Jim Carrey's breakout year ranks amongst the all-time list? Can you think of anyone who has had a better single 12 months? It has to be right up there, surely. And if thought-provoking questions like this keep you up at night, then maybe consider subscribing to Culture Slice. And now, on with the video. Live from Culture Slice Towers, it's Culture Slice Tonight, with your host, Culture Slice. Good evening and welcome to Culture Slice Tonight for February 14th, 2005. Happy Valentine's Day to all the lovers out there. Later on the show, the domain name youtube.com has been activated today for what will apparently be a new video sharing website. Will that go anywhere? Probably not. But first, The Mask finally has a sequel. Released this Friday in cinemas nationwide, Son of the Mask might not have the first movie star, or its director, or Cameron Diaz, or basically anything else, but New Line Cinema has bet close to $100 million that it can indeed repeat the trick. Early critical evaluations don't seem to hold out the same hope. Sorry, just remembering my late night entertainment news glory days for a second there. Anyway, it would be more than a decade after the first film had hit cinemas that a sequel to The Mask would actually see the light of day. Carrey's declining of the offer of a return stemmed from him not wanting to be typecast and the negative production experience he had struggled through on a sequel he did make, the critically derided but still very financially successful Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. Losing its main player was undeniably a major blow. Carrey almost couldn't miss in the 90s. Liar Liar topped $300 million in 97, and even films which were perceived as flops, like 1996's darker comedy The Cable Guy, were still profitable. He would even prove himself as a serious actor, with an almost insanely committed performance as Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon, and his turn at the heart of 1998's The Truman Show, earning him critical plaudits. I still feel to this day that Carrey not getting a Best Actor Oscar nomination for either of them was a pretty huge oversight, but I should probably try to get over that someday. Director Chuck Russell had been interested in Part 2 at first and scoped out ideas on how to evolve the story, but without Carrey he bowed out of proceedings. He instead directed Arnold Schwarzenegger in Eraser, which made over $240 million for Warner Brothers in the summer of '96. Diaz would become a headliner of her own, with her star rising further thanks to the likes of My Best Friend's Wedding and There's Something About Mary. Without Jim Carrey, there was essentially no chance she would make a return for The Mask 2 though. Even if the trail for a feature-length follow-up went cold for a time, the wider Mask brand was still active in the latter part of the 90s. The Mask comic book continued to be a publishing success for Dark Horse, and the animated series ran through 3 seasons between 1995 and 1997. A Mask video game also arrived on the SNES in late 95, more than a year on from the release of the movie, with development taking so long that a Sega Genesis version was cancelled. The studio, now part of a far larger media empire, still wanted another film from the Mask universe though. In the early 2000s, various ideas were batted around for how to make the sequel work. The project eventually fell into the lap of director Lawrence Guterman, who had directed additional sequences on the first DreamWorks animation movie Ants and created a hit in his directorial debut proper, Cats and Dogs, which made over $200 million in 2001. Sure, it was quite a different vibe from Russell's resume prior to the first film, but Cats and Dogs did require considerable amounts of CGI work, and the family film had its moments too. Writer Lance Kazai had experience writing for Politically Incorrect and The Chevy Chase Show, but had never written a movie script before. His choice felt a bit baffling at the time, and given what the movie became, those suspicions were absolutely proved correct. Numerous recognizable names were said to be amongst the actors considered for the role of Tim Avery at various points, but the vital replacement for missing in action Jim Carrey, ended up going to Jamie Kennedy. Kennedy's acting career had taken off when he landed a role in Scream and its sequels, and he'd also become a recognizable comedian who even landed his own show, The Jamie Kennedy Experiment. He'd written and starred in Malibu's Most Wanted in early 2003, which didn't get great reviews, but did find an audience and turn a profit. As Kennedy tells it, he had a number of films in development after Malibu's Most Wanted had performed well, but the allure of starring in such a major movie sequel at the time was something he couldn't ignore. I had 2 projects I was going to do on my own. I had a movie where I was going to be one of 3 co-leads, or I had this huge franchise with a lot of risk. I don't know how much control I will have, but potentially huge upside and be the star, and in the middle of the firestorm. But it's not Jim Carrey. With the potential for more movies and his career being taken to a new stratosphere, despite misgivings and concerns, Kennedy took the role. The Mask 2 went into production in mid-2003 and was filmed largely on sound stages in Australia between November of that year and April of 2004, with mid-filming rewrites and long drawn-out days on sets being the norm. The considerable amount of effects in the movie required a huge amount of work from Industrial Light and Magic, with even more baby and dog CGI scenes added after an apparently disastrous screening for execs of the first 2-hour cut of the movie. So what did Son of the Mask actually end up being about? Well, Kennedy's Avery, a nod to Tex Avery, is a cartoonist who dons the mask for a work party after his dog Otis finds it in a stream. He proceeds to have a night of partying in green and fathers a child with his wife Tonya, played by Trailer Howard. Not only is a baby boy later born with mask-like powers, but Otis the dog dons the mask as well and tries to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Loki, played by Alan Cumming, doing his best with very little, is searching for the missing mask under orders from his Norse godfather, Bob Hoskins Odin. This all leads to a crescendo of chaos, with CGI all over the place and slapstick aplenty, as Tim, Loki and the baby collide, and Son of the Mask becomes exhausting. Prior to release, Kennedy's concerns were clear to see, explaining on press tours that he wanted to be viewed as different to Jim Carrey's portrayal. Roger Moore to his Sean Connery, as he put it. Kennedy would years later recount that he knew the movie would be a disaster when he read the final shooting draft of the script. And watching the film, when you look into his eyes, you can kind of sense that in his performance. Before long, the rest of the world would share that same sense of dread. Son of the Mask was supposed to be a big hit from the very beginning. Not only did they budget more than $80 million for making this thing, but there was considerable marketing spend behind its release. All seemed set up for success, and then people actually started seeing it. I've read a lot of negative reviews in this series so far, but even for the world of Sequelpalooza, the critical analysis of Son of the Mask was brutal. From a witless and vulgar sequel to an irredeemable mess without wit, heart, or a single memorable performance, and loud, mean-spirited, and generally obnoxious, to one presumes the only thing worse than making this disaster is actually watching it. Wouldn't wish either on anyone. It was one horrific review after another.
This was almost a landmark for me. In the 5 years I've been co-hosting the show, this is the closest I've ever come to walking out halfway through the film. And now that I look back on the experience, I wish I had. And here I thought Dumb and Dumberer was going to be the worst Jim Carrey-free sequel I'd see in my life. Believe it or not, Son of the Mask is even worse.
Yeah. To this wall of negativity, Son of the Mask made its way into North American cinemas on February 18th, 2005, landing in 4th spot in its opening weekend behind other new arrivals Constantine and something called Because of Winn-Dixie, a film I have literally no memory of whatsoever. Takings dropped 50% in its second week on release, and the movie left the top 10 for good by its third. It only drew $17 million in the US and Canada, with international takings increasing things to just under $60 million worldwide, considerably below the movie's budget before any other costs were taken into account. It was DOA, a legendary flop and sequel disaster as soon as it was first screened. The most nominated film at that year's Razzie Awards, Son of the Mask was cursed to forever appear in various types of worst movie lists forevermore, and remains a bewildering, high-profile misfire of epic proportions. Kennedy, the poster boy for one of Hollywood's most notorious flops, largely returned to stand-up comedy and bit parts in the years that followed. His TV show had ended, and his 2007 comedy Kicking It Old School arrived to terrible box office and worse reviews. He would end up being inspired to make an entire documentary about the criticism he received that we'll be covering here very shortly. Lawrence Guterman, now with Son of the Mask on his CV, hasn't directed a film since. Aside from a 2012 TV movie called Bra League, Son of the Mask remains the only feature-length script on Lance Kazai's resume. Watching the sequel back so many years later, its complete and utter failure is as little of a surprise as it was then. The special effects are decent, but they're also as soulless as the rest of the film. The movie's over-reliance on them feels like an admission of there being so little else of value here. Kennedy being completely miscast in his role is actually one of the smaller issues in a film which manages to be both frantic and boring. Either way, it's a struggle to get through for sure. Apparently more than half an hour was cut from the final version of Son of the Mask, with what's left such a mess of CGI and chaos that it's kind of overwhelming. Maybe a more sympathetic recut could have at least allowed the film to make sense to the viewer. Or maybe it was simply beyond saving. Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know? On today's show, The Mask isn't the only movie that's a surprising comic book adaptation. Far from it. Did you know that plenty of movies you wouldn't expect started out as comics? Take The Rocketeer, Time Cop, Men in Black, Kingsman, Ghost World, A History of Violence, Road to Perdition, and even Bulletproof Monk. Yep, they're all films which originated as graphic stories before being flung onto the big screen. But 180s classic surprise comic book roots, for me, trump the lot. Because did you know that John Hughes' iconic 1985 sci-fi teen comedy drama, Weird Science, is actually based on a comic? because I didn't, but it's true.
What's weird science?
The film takes its name and basic concept from a sci-fi anthology published by EC Comics in the early 1950s, with the story of Maid of the Future revolving around a man who creates the perfect woman to be his wife. Producer Joel Silver bought the film rights for Weird Science in the early 80s, and Hughes then retooled the story to the one that we know and love. Well, at least I do. To base it around teens Wyatt and Gary's creation of Lisa, played brilliantly by Kelly LeBrock, to help change their fortunes in life. Seen by many at the time as a slightly odd misstep from a director at the peak of his 80s teen movie powers, Weird Science remains a unique film in Hughes' back catalogue 4 decades on from its release. Taking us back to the mid-90s, a TV series of Weird Science starring Vanessa Angel as Lisa debuted in 1994 and ran for 5 series. A film remake has been discussed for years, but who knows if that will ever go anywhere. Maybe that's for the best. In the meantime, as with any number of other unexpected memorable movie moments, we've got an obscure graphic story to thank for the film we got to see. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Join us next time on Did You Know? Making this episode of Sequelpalooza was a bit different. When it came to researching Son of the Mask's disastrous birth, Jamie Kennedy has been so open about it that it took away at least some of the legwork. It also demonstrates how Son of the Mask has haunted him. Most stars of movie missteps run as far away from the film as possible, whereas Kennedy has done the opposite. I mean, a few years back he literally made his own YouTube series about the whole process of its making, and the reaction he received from it originally was a major contributing factor towards him making 2007's Heckler, a feature-length documentary in which he explores the relationship between performers and the criticism they receive from audiences and commentators. Heckler is a fascinating piece of media, featuring a crazy number of startlingly honest soundbites from recognisable faces. It never got much of a cinema release, which I can understand, but as a film, it's super fascinating to me. I guess you could in some way call me a critic, in that I attempt to analyse and critique films in my videos, so to see such a straight up response from someone starring in one of the most infamous of those movies is pretty unique. Even if it does descend into an anti-critic rant from Kennedy and others, Heckler is definitely worth seeking out. Whatever the state of Son of the Mask, Kennedy's candor in confronting his role in one of the most notoriously bad major film releases ever has to be commended in some senses. The detailed breakdown on his channel is a level of no-holds-barred honesty rarely seen in this kind of situation. I mean, it's not like we got a diss track response documentary from Jackie Mason after Caddyshack 2, or Jason James Richter after The Never-Ending Story 3.
Okay, but keep it quiet. If that's possible.
I'm happy!
Even though it does make the life of a YouTuber editing together a video 20 years later considerably easier, Kennedy's relationship with Son of the Mask and the reaction to it doesn't seem completely healthy. Unlike its predecessor, which gets referenced to this day, Son of the Mask has been largely wiped from our collective memory. It feels a bit like Kennedy talks about it more than anyone else. It's hard to know how any of us might react in a similar situation though. I know I can't really comprehend it. I mean, it's one comparatively very small thing, reading a negative comment on your YouTube video, but that's a drop in the ocean to being held largely responsible for what is seen as one of the very worst big budget films of all time. Especially when that film had such a detrimental impact on your career. There is definitely truth to the idea that criticism can sometimes be too harsh or abusive. That trend seems to have faded somewhat, but it's pretty wild to me that I look back at films which are now acknowledged as 80s or 90s classics and see how bad the reviews for them were at the time. Like, am I watching the same movie? There will always be a fascination with films that fail so spectacularly low, and there is no denying that sometimes a movie is just objectively not good, and Son of the Mask is almost universally acknowledged as being in that category. And the whole thing is so awkward. If you played a Son of the Mask drinking game where you drank every time the film felt awkward for viewers and actors, you would be completely wasted so early in the movie that you wouldn't actually make it to the end of it. Wait a second, why have I only thought of that now? Anyway, the Mask brand itself had run out of steam by the early 2000s, and any attempts at creating a nostalgic hit 10 years on were destined to flounder when the film made was so messy and unpalatable. For a major Hollywood release, it is almost unbelievably bad. But is that really Kennedy's fault? The star and director Lawrence Guterman have both said that the final cut was very different from what they envisioned or were promised, and it was ruined by studio interference. Warner Bros. Owned New Line Cinema after the Time Warner merger in 1996, and it's not unthinkable that corporate oversight turned the whole thing into the biggest mess it had any chance of becoming. Kennedy maintains he originally saw the film as a sort of modern psychedelic Three Men and a Baby, with the baby, not him, being the main Mask protagonist, while Guterman claims an unreleased PG-13 version with a darker tone exists, which I'd actually like to see, despite really not enjoying what we did get. But even in its original form, it's hard to imagine it being a lost masterpiece. Either way, the studio had protected their investment somewhat by only putting up a percentage of the budget, with the rest provided by investors. Kennedy's Hollywood career wouldn't be as safeguarded, though he would continue making movies and TV shows, disastrous turns hosting an E3 convention event in 2007, and a live New Year's Eve TV show in 2012 would be many people's first sighting of him in years.
Video games, they've been, where are my jokes?
If a Mask sequel had been made in the late 90s, and if they'd been able to convince the stars and makers of the original to return, then things could have been different. Maybe they could have been different if the vision of the sequel's director had been realised. It definitely felt like there would have been some mileage in exploring the darker elements of the comic book on screen. Who knows? If we're honest, the Mask sequel's goose was probably cooked as soon as it lost Jim Carrey. His ability to nail both the over-the-top comedy of the Mask character and the meek everyman Stanley demonstrates his unique talent and contributed hugely to that first film being a hit. As it is, we are left with a monument of how not to make a second installment in a franchise, a movie years beyond its relevance with a seeming total confusion about who the film was actually aimed at, a lead actor unable to effectively carry the movie he's starring in, over-reliance on special effects to cover for the quality of the script. Son of the Mask really is a tough watch. It's a shame too. The Mask was revolutionary in its use of CGI, it introduced legitimate superstar actors to the world, and future films in the series had potential. But the state of that sequel snuffed that prospect out instantly, and The Mask's chance of making a cinematic comeback was lost in the ocean, never to be washed ashore again. Or was it?
Are we back? Are we back?
In 2019, Mask creator Mike Richardson talked up the idea of a female-led reboot for the film series, but nothing materialized from that. Over the last few months though, seemingly out of the blue, both Jim Carrey and Cameron Diaz have publicly stated that they would be up for a proper Mask sequel, more than 30 years after that original movie. Whether or not it's a question of too little too late, or if this reunion will even end up happening, remains to be seen. Jamie Kennedy is unlikely to get an invite if that movie does get made, and were a legitimate sequel ever released, then Son of the Mask would become even more of a forgotten artifact than it already is. As things stand today, the second Mask film remains Exhibit A for how rebooting a popular Hollywood brand can get completely out of control very quickly. Like finding a mask that grants you incredible powers, it can so easily become a poisoned chalice. Back in May, the world was bracing itself for the return of one of the most legendary film brands of the 1980s. A brand that had seen its ups and downs on the sequel battlefield, before finding redemption thanks to a streaming show that wrote a new, glorious modern chapter. With this being the 6th film in the series, it was high time for a Sequelpalooza showdown to detail that journey. This episode wasn't exactly a roaring success for the channel when it was first released. In fact, you could say that the algorithm knocked it out in the first round. But honestly, it's one of the videos I'm most proud of this year, and that's what really matters, right? Hello? Oh, hi YouTube algorithm. How can I help? Alright, okay, yeah, understood. Thanks then, bye. That was the algorithm, just calling to let me know that, in fact, views are the only thing that matters. Anyway, where was I? How do you follow up a high-kicking instant classic that became permanently etched in pop culture history? Well, Hollywood wasn't really sure, but they were certainly going to find out. Because, as the saying goes, to make honey, a young bee needs a young flower, not an old prune. In the red-hot box office battle of the summer of 1984, a star-free, modestly budgeted martial arts story crane-kicked its way into pop culture history, becoming the underdog success story of the year and delivering some of the most iconic moments in 80s cinema. From there, the Karate Kid transformed into a full-blown Hollywood dynasty, spawning a dojo-sized selection of sequels and reboots. And now, the series is preparing for another cruel summer on the big screen. But did any of those follow-ups over the decades come close to reclaiming former glories? As Hollywood went karate crazy in the wake of the Kid's success, could any of the countless martial arts wannabes even survive the first round? And did a scrappy streaming series secretly hold the blueprint for long-term success all along?
Mercy is for the weak, Todd!
Sweep the leg, wax off and step back onto the mat. This is Sequelpalooza. Our story begins in early 1977. A low-budget boxing drama, written by and starring Sylvester Stallone, has begun its journey to becoming a worldwide movie sensation. Rocky opened in North America in December of 1976 to largely positive reviews but enormous box office, and is now gradually delivering similar results across the globe. It would go on to become one of the most iconic films of the generation. Both the movie's making and success reflected the rags to riches story it told. The film, produced for a little under $1 million, with Stallone having to fight to play the role he had written, would go on to make $225 million in cinemas. If my calculations are correct, that's more than a 22,000% increase on investment. Rocky was not only an absolute triumph for Sly Stallone, but also for its director, John Avildsen. Though Avildsen had directed a number of films already, the pop culture kaboom of Rocky was on an entirely new level. Winning both Best Director and Best Picture at the 1977 Oscars, Avildsen was now a made man in Hollywood. He could essentially do whatever he wanted next, cash in his chips for his dream project, or even take on the inevitable Rocky II first. The world was quite literally his oyster. So what major project did the director of such a huge movie choose from the smorgasbord of productions that lay in front of him? Well, of course, he made a romantic drama with lots of dance routines about a New York City newspaper columnist who falls in love with a terminally ill ballerina. Obviously, Slow Dancing in the Big City arrived in cinemas in November of 1978 and went absolutely nowhere. Making less than $2 million in cinemas, and with his direction, much like the script, receiving generally negative reviews, the momentum Avildsen had created was washed away fairly rapidly. Years later, he would admit regret about not taking the Rocky II job and confess that he only made Slow Dancing because he was in love with writer Barra Grant. The thing was though, in the following years, Avildsen's heart-first career move looked like it might derail things more permanently. 1980's The Formula starring Marlon Brando crash-landed at the box office, and 1981's Neighbours starring John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd suffered through a painful production process, during which the director argued with almost everyone, not least his two stars who lobbied to have him removed from the picture. Avildsen himself said about 1983's unsuccessful A Night in Heaven, "It was really terrible. I knew it, I have absolutely no defense for it. I'd almost be willing to give people their money back. Things were a little messy now for the once golden boy director." But Hollywood loves an underdog story. Before too long, Avildsen was approached by Rocky producer Jerry Weintraub to make a movie far closer to his big hit. It was the story of Daniel LaRusso, a New Jersey teenager being bullied in his new home of LA, who is taught both karate and life lessons from an unassuming handyman called Mr. Miyagi, as he prepares to face his adversary Johnny Lawrence from the Cobra Kai dojo in the All-Valley Under-18 Karate Championship. A semi-autobiographical script written by newcomer Robert Mark Kamen when he was asked by Weintraub to create a martial arts story like Rocky, but not too much like Rocky. The Karate Kid had been inspired by a news story of a young boy who had asked to go to karate school to learn to defend himself from bullies at school. Kamen understood this story incredibly well. He had essentially lived it. At age 17, he had been beaten up by a group of bullies, started learning karate from a tough Cobra Kai style teacher, but instead gravitated towards being taught by a philosophical man named Miyagi, the same name he used for his script. Kamen blended the two schools of teaching, added in other personal experiences like the climactic karate tournament, and incorporated Hollywood elements such as a love story with Elizabeth Shue's Alley. As Kamen put it himself, the movie is basically a dramatization of my own experience. Producer Weintraub reached out to Avildsen directly because of their Rocky success together. He had proven he could combine the visceral excitement of sporting moments with personal struggles in an uplifting, sincere tone that landed perfectly with audiences. It was such a close descendant of the Stallone smash hit that it wasn't uncommon to hear it referred to as the Karate Kid. When it came to casting, Avildsen fought the studio to make sure that Niriyuki Pat Morita could play the pivotal Miyagi role. It's hard to imagine, but there is a world in which Mr. Miyagi is played by anyone else. Columbia Pictures and producer Weintraub were hesitant to cast Morita, given that he was known as a comedian at this stage. He played a recurring role as Arnold in Happy Days and started his career in stand-up. His casting didn't make much sense, but Avildsen saw the vision. He filmed Morita's audition, showed it to Weintraub, and the producer cried as he said, "That is Mr. Miyagi." Numerous up-and-coming names were in the running for the role of Daniel, with Charlie Sheen stating he even turned it down. But in the end, it was Ralph Macchio, largely thanks to his breakout role in The Outsiders, who was cast in the part. William Zabka, an experienced wrestler, was chosen as Johnny Lawrence, with Martin Kove becoming his Cobra Kai sensei John Kreese, who, along with Miyagi, was also a US Army veteran. Neither Macchio nor Zabka had any karate experience, so trained under the film's black belt fight coordinator, Pat Johnson. The climactic battle was considered to be a tough ask for their skill level, so Johnson was cast as the referee to ensure he could keep a close eye on proceedings. During production, not many people involved thought they were making a future classic. Aside from most hating the title, editor Bud Smith remembers it as just a little movie that no one was going to give a about. Macchio thought the script was cheesy and campaigned to call the movie anything else. Most actors' agents told their clients it was just another job, one to be quickly forgotten. But Avildsen kept the faith, as he told a skeptical cast and crew on location, "You guys have no idea what you're making here. This is going to be a classic." The director was, of course, absolutely correct. The Karate Kid wasn't a huge priority for Columbia Pictures prior to release. It had no A-list leads, a modest budget, a director with a recent history of flops, and a script from a relative newcomer. Being labelled as Teenage Karate Rocky pigeonholed it and limited its scope. But gradually, perceptions changed. Execs were blown away by early cuts of the movie, and test screenings went really well. The chemistry between Morita and Macchio, the heartfelt, crowd-pleasing story, the soundtrack, something clicked that the studio hadn't anticipated. It was undeniable. And then the reviews started coming in. A few dismissed it as a Rocky clone, but many loved it. Roger Ebert called it one of the best films of the year and gave it a full 4 stars. To their credit, Columbia responded by increasing the marketing budget, and word of mouth began to spread. In a summer packed with blockbuster heavyweights, one of Hollywood's greatest years ever, suddenly this small, awkwardly titled movie was a real contender. And then, on the 22nd of June 1984, The Karate Kid hit cinemas. It wasn't an instant smash. In fact, it didn't get to higher than 3rd spot in the weekly box office chart across its entire run. But the film soon demonstrated its remarkable staying power. Rather than simply opening and decreasing, takings went up in week 3. It pulled in over $1 million a week at the box office for 4 straight months and remained in theaters right up until the end of the year. The Karate Kid would make over $90 million in its initial North American run, and eventually would take in excess of $130 million worldwide in cinemas alone. A massive return on its modest investment. It became the top video rental title of 1985, launched a mini empire of merchandise and video game releases, and would find a second life on the small screen that has never really come to an end. Calling it a cultural phenomenon is perhaps an understatement. Karate and martial arts, becoming increasingly acknowledged in Western culture in the years prior, were everywhere once the movie became a hit. Interest in dojos in suburbs and cities went through the roof, with karate school enrollment doubling in the US in 1985. Hey, even Young Culture Slice did it badly for a couple of years. And watching it back, the movie itself holds up really well. The fact that Macchio in particular wasn't a martial artist adds a scrappy, believable quality to the fight scenes. The romance between him and Shu is genuinely sweet, and the story being entirely predictable is not an issue as it's just delivered so well. The film is cheesy, but in the best way possible. Cobra Kai are the bad guys, but the relationships within it are complex. Johnny has his own arc, even within the first film. You empathize with the antagonist. This became a building block for what would become possibly the most successful movie-to-TV series transition ever more than 30 years later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in 1984, as well as Bill Conti's excellent score, the soundtrack features at least 2 truly classic 80s movie tracks in the form of You're the Best and Cruel Summer, and the music overall helps to lift the whole experience. Cruel Summer remains an absolute dance floor banger to this day. I think another undervalued strength of The Karate Kid is how genuinely funny it is. Moments like Daniel turning up to the Halloween dance dressed as a shower always cracked me up as a kid, and Morita's background as a comedian brings just the right amount of levity to Miyagi's scenes. And it's that blend, comedy and depth, which for me elevates the whole film to something very special. Morita's layered, empathetic performance is at the heart of it. His scene of drunken antics manages to be both laugh out loud and full of emotional resonance. The fact that he was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for a film so many had dismissed as a Rocky knockoff before release shows how strong his work was here. Miyagi became one of the defining characters of 80s cinema because of the tour de force behind him. The performances are universally strong, but in many ways, this is Miyagi's movie. If you can't tell, I really love this film. Avildson's story in Hollywood, his comeback to not just box office glory, but also his films being celebrated at the Academy Awards, mirrored the against-the-odds nature of the film itself. It became more than just a Rocky clone too. The fact that it told the story of a teenager at a time when audiences were increasingly gaining an appetite for young adult-focused movies allowed it to explore new themes, and the relationship of its 2 leads and the focus on spirituality decades before mindfulness became cool were really something unique. Avildsen was always the perfect choice for the job too, with his realistic shooting style, his affinity with emotional sincerity, and his history of underdog characters fighting against the odds. It's no wonder the excellent 2017 documentary chronicling his life and work was titled King of the Underdogs. He also wouldn't be making the same Rocky-shaped mistake again and signed up to a sequel as soon as it was clear The Karate Kid was a hit big enough to demand one, and that sequel had been greenlit before the first movie had even left cinemas. By early 1985, The Karate Kid Part 2 was already in production. With Avildsen back, Kamen also returned to write the script, and the studio was keen to strike while the iron was piping hot. Picking up exactly where the first film ended, Part 2 told the story of Miyagi taking Daniel to Okinawa, Japan, to visit his dying father. While Miyagi rekindles things with old flame Yuki, played by Nobu McCarthy, Daniel gets his own new love interest Kumiko, aka Tamlin Tomita, who I distinctly remember young Culture Slice fancying a lot. Miyagi's return causes issues with not just his former best friend, Danny Kamikona's Sato, but also his nephew Chosen, played by Yuji Okamoto, who soon becomes Daniel's new rival and sets up the inevitable final battle. Needing to create the visuals of rural Japan, the producers instead opted for the more cost-effective approach of building a village in Hawaii. Filming ran between September and December 1985, with the second film now having the weight of expectation of being one of the most anticipated releases of the summer of 1986. Reactions from critics prior to its release were less positive for the sequel. Roger Ebert recommended it again, but Gene Siskel didn't, even if he did say that it was by no means a bad film that featured scattered pleasures throughout. The praise was considered immoderate, but it wasn't exactly being seen as a barnstormer, labelled as stale and boring by some. As the New York Times review summed it up, even as sequels go in this era of movie megaseries, The Karate Kid Part 2 peters out faster than most. The brand was still hot though, and when the movie landed in cinemas on June 20th, 1986, the general public were ready for action. Opening at number 1 at the box office, something the original never managed, it would remain in top spot for a full month and remain in the top 10 right up until October. Outstripping the first film in North American cinemas, The Karate Kid Part 2 would make more than $150 million domestically and over $130 million worldwide, only outperformed by Top Gun and Crocodile Dundee. In the US and Canada across the entire year, it would end up as the 6th highest grossing movie released in 1986. Given that the success metric at the time for sequels was to achieve 75% of its predecessor, it went beyond expectations. The Karate Kid Part 2 is a really interesting film. It takes some of the cues and story beats of the first movie, but layers them into what is a surprisingly quiet, charming film. The early scenes involving Cobra Kai's seeming dissolution add an interesting layer to proceedings, and, though largely formulaic, it still manages to again pack an emotional thrust kick overall. I enjoyed it quite a lot 40 years on, retaining a surprising amount of impact, and it is for me a worthy sequel. The Glory of Love by Peter Cetera managed to be an even cheesier lead song than You're the Best, but again, it just kind of works. Perhaps unsurprisingly, The Glory of Love had actually originally been written for inclusion in Rocky IV. Now, if you're a regular Sequelpalooza viewer, you might be thinking to yourself at this point, what exactly is going on here? I mean, so far we've covered a successful sequel. If the Karate Kid's 80s and 90s journey would have ended here, everything would have been wrapped up in a nice little package. But this video would not be a Sequelpalooza, so worry not my friends, because almost inevitably, things started to get more than a little messier from here. How many martial arts films of the 80s and 90s owe a debt to the success of The Karate Kid? Well, the answer to that is... well, I don't know the actual answer, but things certainly drastically changed for the genre after Daniel and Miyagi's box office bonanza. Because The Karate Kid didn't just make martial arts cool again, it made them marketable, and Hollywood was clearly paying attention. Pretty rapidly, martial arts movies, which had a checkered history in Western cinema, came crashing back into fashion. Specifically, the underdog martial arts story became its own mini-industry. Cheap to make, these films ranged from shameless knockoffs to more creative efforts just looking to cash in on the moment. Arriving even before Karate Kid 2, No Retreat, No Surrender featured a bullied teen, a wise ghost sensei Bruce Lee, and a final showdown with a Soviet bad guy played by a baby-faced Jean-Claude Van Damme. I am not making this up. There was also Karate Warrior, an Italian mashup of the Karate Kid and Bloodsport, featuring a kid named Olaf mastering the stroke of the dragon. Somehow, it wrapped up 5 sequels in 6 years, officially entering Police Academy territory, just with fewer gags involving hair removal and slightly more dragon strokes. Other films tried to reinvent the formula. Best of the Best went serious and dramatic, with Eric Roberts leading a US team into a high-stakes martial arts showdown, while Only the Strong took a more grounded approach, mixing high school redemption arcs with Brazilian capoeira. One critic called it the kids from Fame armed with very sharp knives. As we moved into the 90s, the focus shifted to younger heroes. Three Ninjas made a splash in cinemas with its mix of Karate Kid and Home Alone, with young culture slice thinking it was pretty awesome at the time too. It also gave us 3 sequels, including the 4th film High Noon at Mega Mountain, which co-starred Hulk Hogan and one of the most ridiculous wigs ever committed to film. Surf Ninjas tried to surf the same wave, with Game Gear time travel, Rob Schneider, and an evil Leslie Nielsen. It happened. There was also mystical mentor flicks like Sidekicks, where Jonathan Brandis fought bullies alongside his imaginary friend Chuck Norris, and The Power Within, a deep cut which saw a kid inherit a magic kung fu ring. This one even cast William Zabka to really up the Karate Kid nostalgia factor. And who could forget Nunchuck Summer Hawaiian High Kicks, the 1988 box office smash featuring Tom Selleck as a wise PI sensei teaching a group of young English kids the way of the world and karate during a sun-soaked summer vacation in Maui. Actually, hang on, that didn't actually happen, did it? Moving on. Decades later, you can still trace the film's influence beyond just movies. While researching for this video, I found loads of articles about how MMA fighters found watching The Karate Kid on HBO as kids was their light bulb moment, the thing that pushed them into training. Sadly, I couldn't find any similar testimonials about High Noon at Mega Mountain inspiring careers in combat sports. But, you know, never say never. Cowabunga dudes, and welcome to another episode of Film 89 for our summer movie special. On tonight's show, will Weekend at Bernie's become the definitive movie release of the entire 1980s? Will Turner and Hooch and K9 prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that buddy action comedies featuring a cop and a dog are the future of cinema? And will The Karate Kid Part 3 be the 3rd film in a row from the beloved series to make at least $130 million worldwide? I think we can all agree that the answer to each of these questions will almost certainly end up being a definitive yes. Sorry about that. Just remembering my late 80s glory days again for a second there. Man, my analysis was just as dodgy then as it is now. Anyway, as the 1980s marched on, seemingly endless sequels became an ever-present part of studios' business plans. Inevitably, the first 2 Karate Kid films led Columbia Pictures to very quickly turn their attention to not just a Part 3, but also diversification. And with Part 2 outperforming expectations, Columbia felt the franchise would only get stronger. But in actual fact, this was when the decline set in. Despite almost all the key players returning in front of and behind the camera, the 3rd film would prove so creatively unsuccessful that Avildsen himself would later call the film he directed a horrible imitation of the original. And honestly, he's not too far off. The story beats are so similar that you can almost feel Macchio's disdain through the screen. It's literally a copy and paste of part 1, just not nearly as good. Daniel reluctantly gets involved in a karate conflict. Miyagi reluctantly trains him for a tournament. Daniel is bullied by a seemingly superior student. The climax is an all-valley tournament. In Macchio's own words, part 3 felt like we were redoing the first movie as a sort of cartoon, without the heart and soul which sold the original. There's a different Cobra Kai boss in Thomas Ian Griffith, who is easily the most entertaining thing in the film, Sean Kanan as Daniel's dangerous new rival Mike Barnes, and a new kind of love interest companion character played by Robin Lively, who is far more tacked on and irrelevant to the plot than Elizabeth Shue's Ali ever was. Perhaps this isn't totally surprising given that the makers realised the 11-year age gap between 16-year-old Lively and Macchio, who was 27 at the time, made an actual on-screen romance potentially very dodgy, necessitating hasty rewrites. The reviews reflected the creatively bankrupt nature of the franchise by the time of the third go-around. Variety called it a particularly dim-witted film that will likely spell the death of the series, and it was a movie the Washington Post thought was so boring that even the love interest leaves early. It was noted as half-hearted and very dull, whilst the material is wearing out its welcome was a common refrain. When it was released on June 30th, 1989, it was clear that the party, if not completely over, was definitely winding down, making it to third place in an admittedly competitive opening weekend behind Batman and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. The trilogy of the series showed little of the staying power of its predecessors. Whereas the first two films had grossed $130 million, Part 3 would struggle to make more than $35 million. Not only does this feel like an unnecessary sequel, but it also has elements that take the series backwards. Character growth is ignored for the sake of a retread story. Daniel reverts back to the scared teenager we met in Part 1. It's less a character arc and more a character loop. The attempts to build drama simply don't land, and just adding more fight scenes and action can't cover up for the complete lack of interest delivered by the script. There's a sort of retro campy energy watching it back all these years later, but this is not a good movie. Although I will throw down with anyone who disagrees with the fact that Thomas Ian Griffith is awesome. His performance alone almost makes the whole exercise worthwhile, but not quite. Anyway, 2 months after the release of Part 3, the Karate Kid animated series debuted on NBC on the morning of Saturday, September 9th, 1989. Featuring Morita as Miyagi, the cartoon had originally been set for a longer run a year earlier, but its single series and shortened 13-episode run reflected the increasingly dwindling interest in a franchise which had run its course. It was yesterday's news. In Hollywood though, a defeat is never really the end of the tournament, and by 1994, without any momentum whatsoever, it was time for a reboot. Ralph Macchio acknowledged that his character had gone backwards and the story was becoming cartoonish. He didn't have much interest in a return, although the studio never actually approached him either. Pat Morita was contracted for another film, and Columbia, now owned by Sony, was keen to see what could be resurrected from the wreckage of Part 3. Producer Jerry Weintraub decided to pivot to a female lead in an attempt to refresh the formula, perhaps even appeal to a wider audience whilst also taking a slightly more serious approach than Part 3. The next Karate Kid was starting to take shape.
In search of the right student. A student in need of the right training.
A young Hilary Swank, who had only made her film debut in Buffy the Vampire Slayer a couple of years prior, was plucked from relative obscurity to play the new lead Julie Pierce, a troubled teenage girl reeling from losing both her parents, who is mentored by Miyagi. Together, they also have to deal with an aggressive group known as the Alpha Elite, led by Michael Ironside, with Julie needing to prove her newfound karate and life skills to survive. Wrapping up on-set production across 8 weeks in the summer of 1993, it wouldn't be released for another 12 months. Reviews for that fourth film continued the downward trend of the series. The performances were quite good, but the film around them wasn't. The Baltimore Sun summed up the overall critical viewpoint. This film feels like a desperate attempt to squeeze a few last bucks out of what was once a very obliging cash cow. When the next Karate Kid made it to cinemas on September 9th, 1994, it was clear that interest was at a new low, landing in 7th place in its opening weekend behind all-time classics like Milk Money and Trial by Jury, along with a few genuine classics. It wouldn't even last a month before it disappeared from screens. Making just under $16 million worldwide, it was far and away the least successful movie of the franchise. Even on video, it didn't really find a secondary audience, only maintaining interest thanks to Swank's later career and its connection to the Karate Kid brand. The rebirth for a new generation didn't really go anywhere. The next Karate Kid's heart was in the right place, but it fell down on execution. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a future Oscar winner, Swank makes a pretty engaging lead, and of course Morita is still awesome, but there is a distinct lack of magic, and the whole thing is very mundane. The movie that writer Mark Lee and director Christopher Kane craft is functional, churned out, and less flamboyantly bad than 3, but it is still pretty bad. It's not like there isn't a little bit of wackiness in part 4, there's a random Falcon subplot, some comic relief Buddhist monks, and for some reason the villains this time are Cobra Kai knockoff high school campus security bros, but it's never fully embraced and just ends up feeling weird and tonally awkward. Lee would only write one more film, a made-for-TV effort called Hostage Negotiator, and Kane would go on to direct the likes of The Amazing Panda Adventure and a 1997 comedy called Gone Fishing, which somehow cost $53 million to make and was so bad that star Joe Pesci apparently took to standing outside screenings to give those people who did pay to see it their money back. Not exactly the dream team to revive the Karate Kid franchise, which, by this stage, was on its knees. The key players in front of and behind the camera, who had made it such a valuable brand to begin with, largely struggled to move on too. Macchio couldn't escape the Daniel LaRusso image in Hollywood, and largely took on indie films, theatre roles and TV show cameos following 1992's My Cousin Vinny. Zabka played the obnoxious jock in more 80s movies like Back to School and Just One of the Guys before transitioning away from mainstream films. After getting into producing and directing, he was nominated for a Best Short Film Oscar in 2004. Writer Kamen bucked the trend, becoming a recurring collaborator with Luc Besson across The Fifth Element as well as the Taken and Transporter franchises. Original director Avildsen would never hit the same heights again. He returned for Rocky V in 1990, but the magic was gone, and his last film would come in 1999 with the Van Damme action flick Inferno. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 81. As for Pat Morita, Miyagi was both a blessing and a curse. He was often typecast in similar roles and rarely got the chance to lead in major projects again. Still, despite personal and health challenges, he continued to work consistently right up until his passing in 2005. For the Karate Kid brand itself, the best part of 2 decades would pass before we would see its name resurface in cinemas. The 2010 reboot, directed by Harold Zwart, wasn't actually meant to be a straight remake, swapping out karate for kung fu and California for China. Produced by Will Smith as a star vehicle for his son Jaden, the film paired him with the legend himself Jackie Chan as the Mr. Miyagi-esque mentor. The story followed Dre Parker, a 12-year-old uprooted from Detroit to Beijing, who, much like Daniel, struggles to fit in before being trained in kung fu by a quiet, grief-stricken maintenance man. All very familiar, and it's certainly slicker than the original, but it felt like a somewhat pointless retread to me at the time, and confusingly titled given the focus is a totally different martial art. Maybe it's just me, but I remember this film as a bit of a disaster. A meaningless retread built on nepotism, directed by the guy who had last made the Pink Panther 2. But based on reviews and box office takings, that wasn't the case. I mean, the nepotism part would eventually ring true for Smith, spelled out by a very genuine cinematic mess a few years later that steamrolled his career as a Hollywood headliner, but looking back now, the 5th Karate Kid film was a hit and received well at the time. It made over $350 million on a $40 million budget, the majority of reviews were positive, and there had been plans to make a sequel to the sequel pretty much from the beginning. In the end, that didn't happen, of course. Script and scheduling issues delayed things before After Earth became such a notorious failure that another movie with the same cast was never going to happen, and Studio Sony and the wider movie business's priorities shifted. If this had been titled The Kung Fu Kid as originally planned and been positioned as a homage to the original with a brand new story and martial arts element, then maybe it would have lasted longer in the zeitgeist. But Hollywood was soon putting all its eggs in the superhero basket and we never saw a follow-up. I wasn't gagging for another film by this stage anyway, but that's by the by, I guess. Either way, the 2010 film seems largely forgotten now, and it appeared like it was finally time to accept defeat for the franchise as a whole. 5 films, spin-offs, and video games had been delivered, hit soundtracks, and a cultural legacy. It had had a long, and more importantly for Hollywood, largely profitable run. Time to hang up the headband and live a life of peace, right? Well, not quite. By 2018, a brand new contender had entered the tournament, and this one would end up changing the game completely, even if that seemed unlikely initially. The final resurgence of the Karate Kid brand wouldn't have anything to do with cinema releases at all. Originally arriving as a YouTube Red exclusive, Cobra Kai was created by writers, directors, producers, and Karate Kid superfans Josh Heald, John Hurwitz, and Hayden Schlossberg as an opportunity to pick up the story 34 years on from the 1984 All Valley Karate Tournament. Bringing back both Ralph Macchio as Daniel LaRusso and William Zabka as Johnny Lawrence, the show smartly flipped the original dynamic on its head, exploring their adult lives decades later. It also introduced a new generation of students, blending legacy and fresh blood to great effect. Numerous faces from across the movies made appearances, and the series embraced the history of what had come before it, whilst also creating something valuable and unique. It was rough and ready in places, but Cobra Kai soon became a surprise breakout hit with fans and critics. And when YouTube scaled back their original drama strategy in 2020, Netflix swooped in to pick up Series 3. I get that some complain about it being cheesy, while some have said it leaned too heavily into comedy, or that it's little more than the OC with karate, but well, I liked the OC, I don't agree, and surely from a purely objective perspective, it's fair to call Cobra Kai a triumph at this stage, isn't it? Not only was it a word-of-mouth hit on YouTube, but it has since achieved enormous viewing numbers on Netflix, and critical analysis was pretty much universally positive too. It reinvigorated the careers of Macchio and Zabka in particular, taking them from recognizable 80s names to legitimate current mainstream stars, and it kind of did exactly the same thing for the Karate Kid brand. Netflix data showed that the premiere episode of the climactic Season 6 achieved over 1 billion minutes of viewing in its first week on release. Crazy numbers for what was seen as a novelty nostalgia trip at first. And they're numbers that I'd be happy to emulate on my videos, so algorithm, if you're listening, you know what to do. Anyway, back in reality. Macchio and Zabka were suddenly stars and exec producers of one of the hottest shows in the world. Macchio has reflected on this, how Cobra Kai has brought the Karate Kid to a whole new generation. How now, it's not just the 40-something parents, but also their kids who stop him in the streets. Sometimes I use the word stupid when talking about Cobra Kai, because it's just stupid how successful it's become. We've had such a warm embrace from close to 4 generations. And it is that generation crossover which wouldn't have been possible if that first movie hadn't have ended up such an undeniable banger. Despite numerous bumps along the way, John Avildsen himself couldn't have crafted a better story of underdog victory against the odds than Cobra Kai finally giving the kid the glorious happy ending it always deserved. Although right now, as we head into the summer of 2025, we're just about to see the writing of a brand new chapter unfold. The Karate Kid is just one of those movies. I must have seen it 100 times, but still, for this video, I watched it again without a second thought. It's almost like there were two phases in the lives of a generation, before The Karate Kid and after. It was, for what it was, a pretty perfect film. If someone had tried to make it 1,000 times over, none would have had the same impact. Something that made following up tough, even if its box office success meant that sequels were inevitable. I thought they actually made a decent fist of it with part 2, but some of the follow-ups and reboots left a lot to be desired. And really, the franchise has Cobra Kai, once a weird little YouTube Red experiment, to thank for its modern-day renaissance. The genius of that show was that it didn't just understand what made the original movie connect, it respected it and then went further. Instead of just relying on nostalgia hits, it actually built something meaningful on top of the foundation. It could have easily been a shallow cash-in, but it wasn't, and that gave it real impact. Cobra Kai explored backstories and character depth in a way we have rarely seen before in similar projects. After spending almost a year so far making a series about Hollywood's often tumultuous relationships with sequels and reboots, I just wish more big screen follow-ups had the imagination, care and originality of the small screen Cobra Kai. A reboot film could have subverted expectations back in the 90s too, but instead we got goofy villains and lazy retreads. And make no mistake, things were pretty rough in the late 80s and early 90s. Cobra Kai became a real turning point for the brand. When it launched, the franchise had become something of a punchline, but the original film's concept, the relatable story, the iconic performances, the confident direction, and yes, that killer soundtrack meant it always had a shot at a comeback, in the right hands. And now, 15 years on from the last cinematic reboot, we're just about to get another Karate Kid movie in cinemas. Bridging both the big and small screen worlds, the film features Ralph Macchio and Jackie Chan, with Ben Wang stepping in as the new lead. With any luck, it will take lessons from both the triumphs and missteps of the Miyagi-verse that came before. If Legends proves profitable, then it sounds like a Cobra Kai movie could be not too far behind. The show's finale left things open-ended enough for another chapter to be written. And if there's one thing this franchise has taught us, it's that if it makes money, or even might make money, then there will be more. As unlikely as it looked after the Karate Kid 3, or the next Karate Kid, this is a franchise that has endured the test of time. And now, in some form or another, the Karate Kid might actually live on forever. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Culture Slice Reviews. Sorry about that. Anyway, I thought I'd bookend things with some thoughts on Karate Kid Legends, which arrived in cinemas on May 30th this year, becoming the 6th big screen installment from the franchise. Coming at a time when Cobra Kai's final season had become one of the TV talking points of the year, it seemed slightly odd to go back to a more traditional Karate Kid story, and there was clearly some IP mashing going on with this film's attempt to merge different eras of the movies into some sort of martial arts Avengers or Justice League. On that basis, it didn't live up to the hype. Despite being on the poster, Ralph Macchio is barely in the thing. What is in the film isn't bad as such, but it's more what isn't in the film that's an issue. At a time when people have been clamoring for more from the Cobra Kai world, and when the slow burn narrative style of that series had proved so successful, the producers instead went with a brand new story arc that flies through most of its story without giving any of it enough time to really matter. Judged purely as a standalone movie, Legends is pretty enjoyable for what it is. The move to New York works. Ben Wang is a solid addition as the next Karate Kid. Joshua Jackson is good as the down on his luck reverse Miyagi. Jackie Chan basically steals the film, and the whole movie absolutely flies by, but it flies by a bit too fast, and I'd basically forgotten about it not long after I left the cinema. Far be it for me to complain about a film being 94 minutes long, but Legends needed at least another 15 or 20 minutes to breathe. Basically, basically all the character exposition is rushed, the climactic tournament finishes before it's even had a chance to really begin, and lots of new character development feels like it might have been left on the cutting room floor. Overall, it was a fun enough film, but one that was in way too much of a hurry. Either way, Legends was a flawed but watchable return for the Karate Kid on the big screen, and while the original is still unforgettable 40 years on, this one sadly didn't live too long in the memory. Thanks for watching another episode of Culture Slice Reviews. From high kicks to high, landers? Yeah, not sure about that one. Anyway, 2 years after the Karate Kid taught us the importance of patience, balance, and waxing on and waxing off, Highlander showed us that eternal life might actually be kind of appealing, unless you have to sit through its sequel. In 1991, Highlander II made fast work of demonstrating that the sequel gods can sometimes be very, very cruel. When the world first got to see the 1991 film Highlander II: The Quickening, there was a moment when it was almost universally acknowledged that this franchise had well and truly jumped the shark. The moment when, going against everything the audience had learned in the first Highlander movie, it was revealed that the immortal human characters so central to the story were in fact aliens from the planet Zeist. But this was only the start of the madness, both on screen and off, for one of the most notorious sequels of all time. Welcome to Sequelpalooza, the series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In 1986, Highlander struck a nerve, a fantasy adventure from a music video director packed with immortals, sword fights, Queen songs, and Sean Connery being awesome. It became the stuff of VHS legend. And then came the sequel. By the early 90s, the original team reconvened in South America for round 2. But the result was a full-blown cinematic meltdown for the ages, with plot holes wider than the Scottish Highlands. How did a sci-fi rock curio written by a university student become such an iconic cult movie? How did Highlander 2 descend into such a monumental disaster that almost everyone involved attempted to disown it? And how was this presumed franchise destroyer only the beginning of the Highlander journey over the coming decades?
There can be only one!
There should have been only one. This is Sequelpalooza. Come on, Johnny, I've told you this already. If he can't be sat next to Madonna for the ceremony, he just won't be at the Grammys. It's as simple as that. Oh hey, didn't see you there. CS here, manager for only the coolest bands. The Durans, Spandau, Men Without Hats, Kajagoogoo, all the big hitters. And here in the mid-80s, if you ain't on MTV, you ain't anywhere. These music video directors have really taken things to another level, so that's why I started representing directors as well. And my newest client, let me tell you, this guy is going straight to the top of the movie business. He's made some of the most iconic videos of all time. He just made the best video ever with Duran Duran for more than £1 million. He's even made his first feature-length film. And his next one, seriously, this is the one. Biggest film of 1986 incoming, no question. And once it gets to the sequel, watch out. We are talking gangbusters numbers here. Anyway, mustache, I've got an 11 o'clock with a record label exec and a couple of Harvey Wallbangers. Ciao ciao darlings, mwah. Sorry about that guy, but he's kind of right. By the middle of the 1980s, MTV and the music video aesthetic had permeated every corner of culture, and Hollywood was no exception. In the end, some of the most important and high-profile directors of the next 30 years would graduate from this new short-form medium. But in the first half of the 80s, there were few hotter names in the music video world than Australian director Russell Mulcahy, and he had plans to conquer the big screen. Mulcahy had made many of the biggest music videos of the time, and his work was stuck on repeat on MTV, from I'm Still Standing to Total Eclipse of the Heart and numerous Duran Duran efforts. Mulcahy was one of the leading lights of what had become a rapidly growing industry. His video for Duran Duran's 1984 song The Wild Boys was a barely hidden pilot for a film version of William S. Burroughs' novel of the same name, which Mulcahy was keen to direct. And yes, CS was right. The music video, which took over a stage at Pinewood Studios and was, for all intents and purposes, a mini-movie, cost over $1 million, an enormous amount of money for a video back then. That same year, Mulcahy released an actual movie, a low-budget creature-featured giant boar horror called Razorback that he'd made in the summer of 1983 in his native Australia. Though he'd previously directed a documentary starring Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, Razorback was the first film that Hollywood took any notice of. Though it wasn't a hit by any means, it was a calling card that gave Mulcahy valuable experience and showcased his visual style. It wasn't like the early big screen efforts of other music video luminaries were blowing up the box office either. The same year Razorback arrived, Steve Barron, who had been responsible for the Billie Jean video and would later deliver all-time MTV classics like Take On Me and Money for Nothing, made his directorial debut with Electric Dreams, a comedy about a love triangle between a boy, a girl and a computer, which ended up being far more famous for its theme song than for the movie itself. But these movies had been made, and the MTV aesthetic was all over huge hits like Flashdance. It felt like just a matter of time before someone like Mulcahy would have a Hollywood smash hit. With a full-length feature under his belt, in between almost constant music video work, the director went searching for his second project. Something bigger, in scope, budget, and prestige. And he eventually found it in an action fantasy script about immortals battling across different centuries, with the final battle happening in the present day. Originally written for a UCLA assignment by student Gregory Wyden in the early 80s. When Wyden's professor read the thing, he quickly suggested that he look to sell it. This turned out to be an excellent idea. It rapidly became one of the hottest undeveloped scripts doing the rounds in Hollywood, before producers William Panzer and Peter Davis paid Wyden $200,000 for the rights to make it. Going through rewrites with contributions from Peter Bellwood and future Beverly Hills Cop 2 and Hunt for Red October screenwriter Larry Ferguson, Highlander's script landed on Mulcahy's desk after it had secured financial backing from Fawn EMI, a subsidiary of the EMI music label the director had made many a video for already, which was now investing heavily into movies. 20th Century Fox agreed to handle distribution in North America. Mulcahy made a strong pitch to be its director, and, with the producers keen for a music video style energy, he got the job. The whole thing could only be described with that most 80s of buzzwords, synergy. The film Mulcahy was so desperate to make centered around Connor MacLeod, who was accused of witchcraft and banished from his 16th century Scottish Highlands village when he somehow survives a fatal attack from Barbarian the Kurgan. But he isn't a witch, he is an immortal, one of a rare group of ageless humans who can live through centuries and only be murdered if they are beheaded. Gory. He is trained and schooled by Ramirez, played with a knowing wink and very little accent by Sean Connery, as he prepares Connor one day to fight in the Gathering, a last man standing showdown between the remaining immortals for the prize, which will finally take place centuries later in modern day, 1980s New York City, a time where Connor will once again face his murderer Kurgan, played by Clancy Brown, who quite literally chews the scenery up. But in the end, there can be only one, An ideal platform for Mulcahy's style, you can see why the director was so keen to make it. For the key role of Connor MacLeod, Mulcahy found his lead in the form of Christopher Lambert, who had made his name with the likes of Greystoke and Luc Besson's Subway, an absolutely awesome movie if you haven't seen it. Lambert didn't speak much English at the time, but he had a haunting, ageless quality perfect for the part. Adding Connery gave the film instant prestige, even if only having him contractually for 7 days of filming made life more complex. With his experience of fast turnaround music videos though, Mulcahy made it work. And that filming took place between spring and summer 1985. Mulcahy prioritized practical effects as much as possible for a sci-fi epic crossing centuries, which gave the film a gritty feel, but also saw Sean Connery almost accidentally beheaded for real at one stage. The former Bond's head survived though, and as the movie wrapped there was every reason to believe it could become a genuine hit. Queen certainly loved it. When Mulcahy approached them to allow the use of one of their songs in the film, the band was so taken with the footage they saw that they proposed contributing the best part of an album's worth. From It's a Kind of Magic to Who Wants to Live Forever, Freddie Mercury and co.'s offering helped Mulcahy's movie come to life. Mixed with Michael Kamen's score, it was a perfect fit. Even though the US version had some minutes trimmed from it prior to release, much to Mulcahy's dismay, taking everything into account, Highlander looked like it had half a chop of becoming a success when it rolled into North American cinemas on March 7th, 1986. And then reality struck. Fox didn't think the American audience would get it and didn't get behind it at all. The poster made Highlander look like some sort of serial killer thriller, and the marketing didn't seem to reflect the unique movie they had on their hands. Landing in 7th spot on opening weekend, behind the likes of Wildcats, Hannah and Her Sisters, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and Pretty in Pink, none of which were new releases that week, it would build no momentum and drop out of cinemas not too much later. Critics were not charmed by the film. Even the best reviews called it a mishmash, though it was also labelled stultifyingly, jaw-droppingly, achingly awful, a film that keeps on exploding for almost 2 hours with nothing at stake, and one that almost never makes any sense. Gene Siskel, perhaps unsurprisingly, dealt the final blow. There were more than a few times during this hyper-violent film in which I felt as if I were a baby being thrown to a dog of a movie. Making just $5.9 million in North America against its $19 million budget, things were not looking good. As producer Panzer remembers, Fox basically threw Highlander 1 away. They had a curious disrespect for the intelligence of the American people. The film opened and closed, and we were grotesquely depressed. We'd been royally screwed by 20th Century Fox. But then, something started happening. Highlander became a hit across Europe, adding almost $13 million to its takings, but it absolutely blew up on video, finding a huge fan base, including in the US, and becoming an important entry into the sci-fi movie world for a generation of adolescents. It lost money in cinemas, but would seemingly live forever through home media. Looking back at the reviews, I don't really understand them. It is the flashy 80s music video aesthetic that makes the film unique. It has style, but also substance. The relationship between Connor and his wife Heather, played by B.T. Edney, gives it genuine emotional warmth. Even the relationship with Ramirez feels genuine. It's a bit ridiculous for sure. The accents, from Lambert's French Scotsman to Connery's Scottish, Spanish, Egyptian, are all over the place. But it's fun. Everyone gives their all. Connery in particular seems to be having the time of his life, and it looks amazing. It's also a complete package. I'm not even a huge Queen fan. Like, I obviously acknowledge Freddie Mercury is an incredible frontman and their music is catchy, but I wouldn't ever chill out and play a Queen record as an adult, if you know what I mean. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. In Highlander, their music fits like a glove and gives it a unique and original angle. The songs take the whole movie to another level. Anyone who can hear Who Wants to Live Forever in this film and not well up even a little bit is quite frankly made of stone. It's part of the reason why it's a shame that it was such a flop in its first run on the big screen. With the music and the visuals combined, Highlander is just so cinematic, but the fact that it was an unquestionable smash hit on video meant that it could live on. Perhaps not forever, but at least for a sequel, even if everything seemed nicely wrapped up in part 1. With the template established, a follow-up would be a slam dunk. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. In a world where VHS was still cool, slices were half price on Tuesdays, and sequels were often mind-boggling for all the wrong reasons, one YouTube channel dared to go further. Introducing Club Slice, a bold new dimension where members get early access to main channel Culture Slice videos, exclusive series, and plenty more retro goodness on the way. So smash that join button or click the link in the description to become a member and experience the deep cut. Very occasionally, we get a movie so misguided, so confused and confusing, so swept off course by external factors and internal errors, so poorly received by literally everyone that its very failure becomes a work of art in itself. A masterpiece of disaster, a true all-timer for the Sequelpalooza Hall of Shame, featuring space aliens from the planet Heist. In 1991, the world got to see Highlander II, The Quickening. Producer William Panzer had long said there would be no sequel, to the point that the ending of Part 1 actively avoided allowing for a straightforward route to a follow-up. But money talks and a diabolical sequel walks, or whatever the phrase is. And by the late 80s, Highlander's success on video and TV shifted the producer's perspective on making another one. European distributors who had seen Highlander become a box office smash hounded them for a follow-up. In Panzer's words, they were told to make it work. Mulcahy was open to returning. After Highlander, the director had continued to make music videos, though at a slower rate, as his Hollywood career didn't quite take off as he might have hoped. In fact, by the time Highlander II was confirmed, he hadn't actually made another film. He was originally set to make Rambo 3, but would eventually be replaced by second unit director Peter MacDonald due to creative differences with Sly Stallone. Although the Denzel Washington thriller Ricochet would actually end up being released before it in North America. At the time Highlander 2 went into production, this would be the first movie he'd made since Highlander 1, the best part of half a decade earlier. Lambert had managed to make other films, both in the US and his native France, but none had been hits. If Connery was in, so was he. The former Bond was considered by the distributors to be vital to the film's success, and he agreed to return, receiving $3 million for just 6 days of filming. Nice work if you can get it. The cast was filled out by the likes of Virginia Madsen as a Rebel Alliance leader, and Connor's new love interest, Michael Ironside as the evil Katana, and John C. McGinley, who will always be Dr. Cox to me, playing a nasty corporate overlord who, for some reason, decides to adopt a ridiculous put-on Orson Welles impression. It's up there with Dan Aykroyd in Caddyshack 2 as one of the most bizarre vocal choices we've seen on Sequelpalooza so far. The producers and various writers struggled to crack the concept of a sequel. Original creator Wyden was busy on Backdraft at the time, and multiple scripts were rejected by the director and star for being terrible. Perhaps they should have quit while they were ahead at this stage, but they had secured independent financing and eventually came to a concept that seemed acceptable. Highlander 1 screenwriter Bellwood returned to pull the whole thing together, with a baffling alien origin story at its centre. Highlander 2's big reveal would end up being that the Immortals were, in fact, aliens from the planet Heist. As producer Panzer reflects, we made a choice to attempt to answer a question that the audience had asked us over and over again. Where do these guys come from? Well, you know, it probably was a question we shouldn't have answered. But that choice was only the start of the problems. First, there was the decision to move production to that famous hotbed of blockbuster filmmaking, Argentina. That's right, Highlander II's producers had been persuaded to decamp the whole exercise to South America, allowing them to make the most of cheaper labor costs, huge Buenos Aires sound stages, tax incentives, and favorable exchange rates to stretch the movie's budget as far as possible. Lavish sets akin to Blade Runner were built on location, but with serious difficulty. Argentina's film industry struggled to cope with the movie's requirements, causing considerable delays on equipment, props, supplies, and crew. More and more American-British crew members were flown over as production scaled up, and the locals struggled to cope. Not ideal timing, as tensions from the Falklands War meant relations between Argentines and Brits weren't exactly at their peak. An even bigger problem, though, was the country's economy, which completely collapsed as filming commenced in March 1990. Hyperinflation drastically increased the price of, well, everything, and Argentina's rapidly fluctuating currency caused untold issues. With political and economic chaos unfolding in the outside world, the drinking culture on set kicked up to a whole new level, causing hangovers, delays, and increased injuries and issues during filming. I mean, who doesn't love a liquid lunch, right? But maybe after the movie is completed? And it wasn't like they needed more help with self-inflicted injuries. Lambert refused the use of fake swords and ended up having part of his finger chopped off during a fight scene. Speaking of Lambert, he led the disdain from the cast for the script, openly mocking the Zeist concept and attempting unsuccessfully to get things changed. As fellow producer Davis put it, every morning I woke up and realized that the best part of the day was behind me. Somewhat unbelievably, things were about to get even worse. With costs spiraling, a completion bond company, who had been installed as an insurance policy for the film's financial backers, stepped in and took control of production, forcing script rewrites, pushing the film to get made faster, ramping up the Planet Zeist elements to 11, and even taking over the final edit and locking Mulcahy out of his own film. In the director's words, the Bond company butchered the movie. Now, Highlander II didn't need to make sense or be good. With the Bond company in charge, it just needed to get made. This turned a film that didn't seem like it would be a masterpiece in the first place into a complete fiasco. The finished movie took us to the dark dystopian year of 2024, where the aging and no longer immortal Connor MacLeod must regain his immortality to take on Ironside's character General Katana, his arch-nemesis from a distant past on their home planet, as the film explains that immortals are actually aliens from Zeist who have travelled across space and time. Oh, and Connor helped to build a shield to save the planet, Earth that is, from radiation decades ago. But that shield is now controlled by an evil corporation and is slowly destroying all life. Oh yeah, and Connery's Ramirez is back to help him, along with environmental activist Madsen, who believes that the ozone layer has repaired itself, or something. In yet another blow, with negative stories swirling around the project, Fox turned down the opportunity to release Highlander II, and no other studios wanted to know. It would end up being picked up by Interstar Releasing, who, yeah, weren't exactly in the same league. After all the production problems, bad decisions, and the insurance company taking over the film, they were left with a movie that essentially nobody was happy with. Everyone knew Highlander II was DOA. Mulcahy disowned the film, fought unsuccessfully to have the director's name changed to Alan Smithee, and walked out of the premiere in disgust. And then Highlander II opened in cinemas. Going back and looking at the reviews from the time, they weren't quite as brutal as I might have thought. They were terrible, of course, but the Quickening seemed to be met with bemusement as much as anything. What on earth was going on was the general consensus. Roger Ebert called it the most hilariously incomprehensible movie I've seen in many a long day, a movie almost awesome in its badness, while the Miami Herald's review noted that the plot gimmick not only makes the sequel unworthy of Highlander, it nearly destroys the charm of the original. As the Toronto Globe and Mail put it, the profoundly silly plot sinks this film beyond redemption. The movie opened across Europe throughout 1991 with a 100-minute runtime and a bizarre stars floating into space ending. before the Bond company made even more hacks and dropped the truly heinous, even more incoherent 91-minute version in November that became notorious for all the wrong reasons. In North America, it managed to make just over $15 million, which paled in comparison to the reported $30 million plus budget alone. Highlander 2's reputation would only grow over time, and its place on the Mount Rushmore of bad sequels would be secured. In the preceding years, Mulcahy got a chance to revisit his most notorious disaster. Seeing the light of day in 1995 on video was his Renegade cut, which removed mentions of the planet Zeist, added scenes which had been hacked off in the cinematic releases edit, and attempted, perhaps in vain, to pull something out of the furnace. Either way, Highlander 2: The Quickening is likely to always remain a truly tragic example of how not to get a successful movie made. But the thing is, even if the Highlander sequel proved an unmitigated failure, renewed interest had been sparked in the original film on the small screen. And though The Quickening was bashed from all sides, the franchise's lore began to grow regardless, and it largely had television to thank for saving its name from the abyss. In 1991, Davis Panzer Productions started developing a series based on the Highlander concept, which completely ignored the second movie, a move that seemed sensible overall. Arriving on TV in 1992, Highlander the series starred Adrian Paul as Duncan MacLeod, a new, younger immortal from the same clan, with Lambert making an appearance in the pilot for continuity purposes, and there wasn't a planet Zeist in sight. It became a syndicated hit for the producers, running for 6 seasons and cleansing Highlander's image more generally. But the producers wanted a full reset, and by 1994, the series had done such a good job of reinvigorating the brand that 2 more entries in the Highlander canon arrived on the scene. They weren't exactly successful, but they were undoubtedly there, and somehow they were in the process of creating a franchise. In a move that seemed unlikely, when the ultra-violent original arrived, Highlander the animated series would turn up on screens for younger audiences in the autumn of 1994. Riding the wave of the TV show's popularity, this French-Canadian co-production told the story of Quentin MacLeod, a descendant of the clan who battles evil immortal Cortan in the 27th century. Attempting to diversify Highlander to make it kid-friendly, this only saw moderate success across 2 syndicated seasons and remains a slightly odd footnote in the story. It did inspire its own video game though, The Last of the MacLeods for the Atari Jaguar, which I'm reliably informed was terrible. Sadly, I'll never get the chance to play it. A third film, Highlander III: The Sorcerer, also conveniently sidestepped the sequel's storyline in the mid-90s, going into production with Mulcahy returning for a spot of redemption until a dispute around his salary saw him drop out to be replaced by fellow music video director Andy Morahan. I guess they thought that lightning might strike twice with getting another video director on board for their debut feature. And they still had Lambert, plus a crazed performance from Mario Van Peebles as his new nemesis. Completely ignoring the second movie was a good move, but at this stage maybe rolling out a film starring Paul's Duncan MacLeod would have made more sense. With a $34 million budget behind it, The Sorcerer arrived in various international territories in late '94, before being rolled out in North American cinemas in January of '95, where it went even further by dropping the "free" from the title and calling itself Highlander: The Final Dimension in a last-ditch attempt to distance itself from The Quickening. Clearly though, on the big screen at least, Highlander's moment had passed. The movie scraped past its budget in cinemas, securing $36.7 million thanks largely to the non-American markets, and sank without much of a trace. Critics labelled it an incoherent mess, no more compelling than the average pile of bricks, and an unbelievably trashy meltdown of the Tartan Warrior franchise. Morahan followed the blueprint with fast cuts, plenty of special effects, and loud music, but without any soul, or bothering to actually make a good movie around it all. It might not be as bad as Part 2, but it's a bland, forgettable retread that has very little of interest to add. Back on TV, the Highlander series was building momentum. Genuinely a decent watch, with Paul an engaging lead, it was such a syndicated hit that when it wrapped up in 1998, it very quickly spawned a spin-off in the form of The Raven, which followed another immortal in Elizabeth Grayson's Amanda, and ran for one season. To reinvigorate the cinematic element of this rapidly growing franchise, I never quite understood why they didn't just attempt to transfer a beefed up version of their hit show to the big screen, and in the end, they kind of did that, just a few years too late. With Highlander the series coming to an end, a fourth film went into production in the summer of 1999, and this would be the film to finally bridge the Highlander worlds. Apart from the second film's world, nobody wanted to bridge that, although it did inherit a couple of things from the Quickening, a painful journey to release, and some truly heinous reviews. Directed by yet another debutant in Doug Arniakowski, who amazingly enough was not graduating from music videos, Endgame unites Connor and Duncan MacLeod as the two faces of the franchise must unite to fend off Bruce Payne's character Jacob Kell, who has become too mighty for any one immortal to face alone. The problems for this one started, you guessed it, right from the start. Director Arniakowski got half the time he needed for pre-production. Studio backer Miramax, who had picked it up through their Dimension brand with the hopes of reheating a once successful film series, forced the producers against their will to make the movie in Romania, as it was cheap. Head baddie Payne got bronchitis, pushing the shoot months behind schedule. Dimension, aka the Weinstein brothers, overrode the producers in the edit, rushing effects work and making numerous cuts to the film. This gave a movie that had a lot of explaining to do already even more of an uphill task. And to top it all off, it was not screened prior to release. Never a good sign. But you know what? This one actually wasn't that bad. The reviews are scathing, as had become a pattern with the series, but the finished film was certainly the best since part 1. It had a decent villain, great fight choreography, and a couple of legitimately impactful plot points. I might have actually gone insane after consuming so much Highlander in such a short space of time, and it's not some grand masterpiece, but despite all its flaws, as a supposed climax of the story, I think Endgame deserves more than its terrible Rotten Tomatoes score suggests. Not many agreed with me at the time though. LA Weekly called it deathly dull. The New York Post noted it was a shapeless, tedious, hopelessly bad sequel, and Entertainment Weekly simply stated philosophically the endless, numbing sameness of it all. Audiences didn't buy it much either, although Dimension scaling back its support didn't help. It ended up making just $15.8 million against its $25 million budget, and it finally seemed like the power of immortality was fading. In the following years, attempts were made to right some of the film series' wrongs. A producer's cut of Endgame appeared on DVD, adding more than 10 minutes of footage and making changes to the version forced on them by the Weinsteins. A special edition of Highlander II, which attempted to expand on Mulcahy's Renegade version and make a more coherent film from the dumpster fire of Highlander II, also arrived in 2004. As for new content though, that appeared to be it. But like a resurrected Sean Connery going suit shopping and drinking whiskey, by 2007 the party wasn't quite over yet. It had just moved to the Sci-Fi Channel for the first of what would be a new cinematic dawn, although it was so bad and unsuccessful that there would finally only be one. From Lawnmower Man director Brett Leonard, producers Davis and Panzer envisioned this as the catalyst for a trilogy of new Highlander movies built around Paul's lead character, attempting to answer the franchise's key question: what was the source of immortality? Originally seen as an opportunity to get Highlander back in cinemas, that ship rapidly sailed when the early reactions to the finished movie, its wonky story and shoddy effects work, was so poor that it ended up being shipped off to Sci-Fi to be the start of a new TV movie trilogy. But once they'd hacked off 10 minutes or so to fit the broadcast window, the source managed to be even worse. When it debuted on Sci-Fi in September 2007, reaction was overwhelmingly negative for a film which encapsulated the sad decline in quality of a concept which once felt genuinely fresh and exciting. It would later arrive on DVD, where reviews range from very bad to even worse. I'm not going to attempt to defend this one. The source is absolutely diabolical and dull as dishwater, even for what would eventually be a TV movie. It's like someone has created a parody of a bad Highlander sequel with no obvious redeeming features that really nobody needed. If the source had been released as the first sequel in 1991, maybe people would herald this as one of the worst ever. But as it is, so few actually ended up seeing it that it instead drifted away to obscurity. As Paul would later reflect, I don't think it was a Highlander movie. It was a film that happened to have Duncan MacLeod in it. We lost what made Highlander special. If we're honest, what made Highlander special had been lost a long time ago. This was a series which traded in quality for output not long after Part 1, a series that managed to spawn not just one of the most high-profile one-star efforts in cinema history, but a litany of lower-profile fright fests as well. But honestly, as much as a lot of the quality of the Highlander entries was very questionable, you really do have to respect the hustle to just keep going after the horrendous experience of that second film. Making it, watching it, reviewing it, it was all awful all the time. Davis Panzer Productions managed to somehow continue this cash cow with numerous films, television series, comics, video games, and bundles of merchandise. Not all good, of course. In fact, mostly far from it, but they never stopped believing, despite a huge amount of evidence to the contrary. Decades worth of evidence. They probably made an absolute boatload of cash from VHS and DVD sales, and in many ways their commitment is admirable. But from a purely selfish perspective, after researching this video, I am personally glad they didn't make any more. Revisiting the Highlander story in Hollywood definitely brought me down a bit, and not because I had to watch some really terrible movies. Well, not just because of that anyway. It reminded me that Highlander's initial 80s success represents an era that has been lost, in all likelihood forever. An era where a movie could be a box office bomb in cinemas, but with its second life in home video could still spark an entire franchise. A time when movies were starting to be made for the video market, and when films could build a legacy through TV viewing. A time when physical media could allow big screen failures to truly become immortal. The dissolution of the video and later DVD market has robbed us of so many potentially classic, low and mid-budget movies. To take the words of Matt Damon to succinctly surmise the issue, it was a big part of our business, our revenue stream, and technology has just made that obsolete. You could afford to not make all your money when a film played in the theatre because you knew you had the DVD coming behind the release. 6 months later, you'd get a whole other chunk. It would be like reopening the movie almost. This was as true for Rounders as it was for Highlander, and that revenue stream evaporating means we get fewer movies like them these days, which isn't great, even if you take into account how woeful some of those Highlander sequels became. Modern Hollywood doesn't seem to have been deterred though. A brand new Highlander remake is set to begin filming soon, with Henry Cavill in the lead, Russell Crowe as Ramirez, and a cast which reportedly also includes Karen Gillan and Dave Bautista. Though I personally like to see Hollywood give the opportunity for new concepts rather than raiding yet more 80s IP, the fact that the $100 million project comes from John Wick director Chad Stahelski is hopefully an encouraging sign. Neither William Panzer or Peter Davis, the production duo that pushed Highlander to carry on when all hope seemed lost, has sadly lived to see the sick film make it in front of the cameras. But in a nice sense of continuity, Davis's son Joshua is amongst the producers, as he remembers when he asked his father in one of their final conversations if he would retire after the new Highlander made it to screens. The reply was simply, "Josh, after we make this movie, we're going to make 5 more. We'll have to wait to see whether they should have let sleeping immortals lie, I guess." What is the worst sequel of all time? Maybe one day in this long Sequelpalooza journey across time and space, I'll come to a conclusion on that. But Highlander 2 has to be a contender. Where it went wrong is pretty clear. Shooting in Argentina at a time of economic chaos in the first place, creditors taking over creative decisions, a lack of cohesive strategic vision, a story which couldn't really hold a candle to part 1 to start with. The Bond company stepping in to turn the crazy and nonsensical up to the max made the film worse, but everything I have seen, read and heard in making this video gave me the impression that Highlander 2 was still going to be a bit of a clanger before they intervened. Either way, it ended up being a truly bewildering, jumbled mess, succeeding in scorching almost all of the goodwill and logic established by the first movie. The Quickening has become a punchline for bad sequels for good reason. The first film had never been intended to launch a franchise, and without that forward planning, they were always starting 2 steps behind. But to end up with something this diabolical does take a special set of circumstances. Unless it had a really clever spin on the story, Highlander 2 objectively had no creative reason to exist, and revealing that immortals are actually from another planet just was not going to cut it. With all that said, there is a strange sense of enjoyment to be found in the total ridiculousness of it all, and although Highlander 2 is obviously not the movie Mulcahy envisioned, you can see very occasional small nuggets of a film he might have made under different circumstances. Kind of. Mulcahy's recut renegade version attempted to improve things as best it could in a very DIY way, but maybe it's sometimes best to let sleeping aliens from the planet Zeist lie. You might be able to make an argument that some of the later Highlander sequels from the MacLeod-verse are actually worse, if you were so inclined and your non-immortal life depended on it. They are certainly more boring than the Quickening, which maybe is the biggest sin of all. The first Highlander had such a neat and concise narrative, with a satisfying conclusion. From the talent to the music to the timing of the film arriving on VHS, it was lightning in a bottle, a moment that could never be repeated. There should have, you guessed it, been only one. Sorry, I swear that's the last time I'll say that. The first Highlander film stands up well to viewing these days. It's ridiculous and over the top but charming too, and remains the closest Russell Mulcahy got to transferring the essence of what made his music videos so memorable to the big screen. Its sustained relevance demonstrates the level of connection people felt to that original film. Despite what this guy thought, as with other music video director pioneers of the 1980s, Mulcahy's Hollywood career wouldn't ever really flourish completely in the post-Highlander years. In the 90s he made Blue Ice with Michael Caine, The Real McCoy with Kim Basinger, and The Shadow in 1994, but nothing quite clicked or made any money. The Shadow especially was a high-profile flop, even if Young Culture Slice remembers thinking it was pretty cool at the time. By the end of the 90s, he was reuniting with Christopher Lambert to make serial killer thriller Resurrection, but it didn't even make it to cinemas in the US. Though he later made an entry in the hugely profitable Resident Evil film series, his unique style never quite transferred as successfully as this guy and others were convinced it would. The fact that Highlander 2 and its unbelievably messy journey to the screen exists makes for a pretty fascinating story all these years later, even if most of those who actually lived through its making would be unlikely to agree, with Mulcahy himself taking a reflective stance on the lowest point of his career CV. It was strange and ridiculous. What a disaster. It's weird how they built a huge franchise off the first film. Once you break your own rules, the audience feels betrayed, which is what happened with Highlander 2. If a franchise can survive Highlander 2 and go on for decades, then we can be confident that a franchise can survive essentially anything. And given its ability to regenerate despite seemingly insurmountably bad entries into the series, with a blockbuster rebirth on the horizon, this is a franchise that might actually prove to be immortal. But who wants to live forever anyway? It's the most wonderful time of the year, unless you're not watching this video in the run-up to Christmas, of course, in which case it's probably just Tuesday. But whatever day it is, we've got one last Sequelpalooza present under the tree tonight. Way back in the simpler times of December 2024, our very first Sequelpalooza Christmas special explored Macaulay Culkin's true festive masterpiece, the sequel that conquered the world the second time around, and the truly tumultuous tale of this six film franchise. You guys give up, or are you thirsty for more?
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!
Yes, thank you, Santa. Ho, 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 indeed. Merry Christmas, because that's right, it's time for that magical annual holiday tradition. Ignoring the fact that this is the first one ever, yes, it's the Sequelpalooza Christmas special. And at this festive time of year, today we're going to be covering one of the most iconic Christmas films ever made, its highly successful sequel, and the four sequels/reboots that have followed over the next 30 plus years since their release. That's right, it's Christmas, and we're going to zip wire feet first into the story of Home Alone. How did the first movie defy the odds to go from an unwanted holiday stepchild of a project dumped by its original studio to one of the most profitable films of the 1990s? Establishing the biggest new child star for decades, and even managing a genuinely blockbusting sequel just 2 years later. Does the late 90s third installment from the Home Alone universe deserve the bad reputation that precedes it? What happened next for the 80s legend whose own family holiday worries became a billion-dollar idea? And how painful have things really become as the festive franchise has continued to churn out seemingly endless small-screen sequels that hold as close to the formula as possible?
Oh, Lisa, haven't you seen Home Alone? If some burglars come, it'll be a very humorous and entertaining situation.
Home Alone goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Merry Christmas, you filthy animals. This is Sequelpalooza. As the 1990s began, pop culture still had one foot in the previous decade. Nirvana's Nevermind hadn't yet signaled a seismic change in the music industry, as Phil Collins and Michael Bolton battled it out at the top of the Billboard Hot 100. The Disney Renaissance had only just begun, with the release of The Little Mermaid less than 2 months prior, and shows like Cheers and The Golden Girls were still dominating the small screen. One of the most impactful filmmakers of the previous 10 years was also finding his feet at the dawn of the 90s. There aren't many names in cinema more symbolic of the 1980s than John Hughes. With the back-to-back series of coming-of-age teen comedies and dramas he wrote or directed in the middle of the decade, a run of films that took in his directorial debut 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Weird Science, Pretty in Pink, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Some Kind of Wonderful, ending up defining an entire era for a generation of movie fans. I mean, for a long time as a teenager, I wanted to move to Shermer, Illinois, but you know, it never did really exist. Anyway, Hughes had already made a noticeable shift towards less teen-oriented work, though he had written the successful first movie in the National Lampoon's Vacation series in the early 80s. It wasn't until 1987's Planes, Trains and Automobiles that he proved he could direct a hit outside of his teenage comfort zone. The Steve Martin and John Candy comedy remains a rare Thanksgiving-based classic to this day. Not every movie he was involved in was a roaring success, however, with She's Having a Baby becoming a box office flop in 1988. He eventually followed up Planes, Trains with another comedy directorial success, 1989's Uncle Buck, and ended the decade writing a festive favourite of the Culture Slice household, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Vacation was one of the few late 80s Hughes comedies which didn't feature John Candy, who took on the title role of Uncle Buck alongside a breakout performance from a young child actor named Macaulay Culkin. Hughes would see Culkin as the ideal star for a film that he'd first conceived prior to leaving on a family vacation. Even in the era of the concept film, it was a pretty straightforward elevator pitch, as Hughes remembered at the time. I was going away on vacation and making a list of everything I didn't want to forget. I thought, well, I'd better not forget my kids. Then I thought, what if I left my 10-year-old son at home? What would he do? And so Home Alone was born. Or rather, the concept was. Getting the thing actually made proved slightly more complex. For a director, he initially turned to Patrick Reed Johnson, who was just in the process of completing the sci-fi comedy Spaced Invaders, but he eventually passed. Though Reed Johnson would direct Baby's Day Out from a Hughes script a few years later, and it's difficult to have envisaged just how big the film he turned down would become, he still missed out on directing Home Alone. So, yeah. In need of someone behind the camera, Hughes looked to his experience getting Christmas Vacation made, and the man who he'd initially wanted to make that. To fill the director's chair, he passed the script to Chris Columbus. Though Columbus had written both Gremlins and The Goonies, and would go on to deliver some of the biggest box office smashes of the next 2 decades, by the end of the 80s, his career was spinning its wheels. After the highly underrated, but only moderately successful adventures in babysitting in 1987, he had delivered the critically derided and commercially disastrous Heartbreak Hotel 1 year later. Having left Christmas Vacation due to a fairly major personality clash with its star Chevy Chase, he was at something of a crossroads himself. I desperately needed a job and was on the verge of probably never directing again. I quit Christmas Vacation, and I think John, in his own way, admired that. 2 weeks later, he sent me 2 scripts, one of which was Home Alone. He's basically responsible for me continuing to work as a director today. As Columbus tweaked the script and prepped the movie, Hughes was working on ensuring it could actually get made. Studio backer Warner Brothers, who had agreed to finance the film with Hughes as producer, were getting cold feet as the budget crept up over the initially agreed $10 million and on to more than $14 million. When Warner's demand of more than $1 million being chopped off the top of the budget was refused by Hughes and exec producer Scott Rosenfeld, they shut the production down. As things stood, Home Alone would have been lost for the sake of $1.2 million. But Hughes, by now experienced in the art of war that is Hollywood film production, had a backup plan. He had been involved with secret covert meetings with 20th Century Fox execs who agreed to take on the project if Warner's pulled the plug. When they did, the now Fox-backed movie picked back up almost immediately. In the end, Home Alone was made for around $18 million. We'll get into it in a bit more detail shortly, but yeah, not a bad financial investment. Given that Hughes had written the film with him in mind, it came as no surprise that Macaulay Culkin would take on the role of Kevin McAllister. As Columbus remembers, I think John knew all along that he wanted Macaulay in the movie. I ended up seeing 200 other kids, looked over hundreds of videotapes, then Macaulay read, and you immediately knew this was the kid. With their young star in place, the rest of the cast was filled out by a combination of young newcomers and experienced performers. John Candy even turns up for a cameo as Gus Polinski, the poker king of the Midwest. The story goes that he was offered a small percentage of the film's profits for just 1 day of work, but he turned it down, choosing to do a favor for Hughes and taking home just $414 instead. We all know the story of Home Alone almost as if we studied it in school. Boy's family heads to Paris for Christmas, but accidentally leaves him behind. Boy thinks his family have disappeared and is loving it. Boy gets freaked out by the scary neighbor, but later learns he isn't so scary. Boy realizes he needs to protect his family home from the wet bandit robbers, played by Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. Convinces them everyone is still there, but by Christmas Eve, they know otherwise. So, as Mum Catherine O'Hara scrambles to get back home, Boy uses his ingenuity, along with a Hollywood crew of prop designers and stuntmen, to do just that in an impressively elaborate fashion. Production on Home Alone began in February 1990 and lasted for around 3 months, though the exterior was clearly a real house, and it's a house worth a serious amount of wedge these days. The interior of Kevin's castle was constructed in a closed-down Illinois high school. Columbus quickly became adept at working with child and stunt actors. As they watched the footage back on set, they realized that they could be onto something a bit special. I'd yell cut and everyone was silent. I'd walk up to the stuntmen and say, "Are you okay?" And they'd say, "Perfect, no problem." We'd go back to the monitors and watch the playback, and that's when we realized it was hilarious. When it was ready for release by the late autumn of 1990, not everyone in the critical class was laughing quite as hard. Wild as it is to look back on now, reviews weren't universally positive. Some liked it, but many didn't. Siskel and Ebert were dismissive in their analysis of this dopey new comedy.
And that's the premise of the dopey new comedy Home Alone. Writer-producer John Hughes and his director Chris Columbus have made a sort of a preteen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and the formula is wearing thin on me.
It's fair to say that this wasn't being seen as a blockbuster in waiting by many, and hindsight is a wonderful thing of course, but I genuinely can't understand why. This had box office banger written all over it. The general public, of course, ended up agreeing. Arriving in cinemas in mid-November 1990, Home Alone soon became a sensation. Outperforming Rocky V and The Rescuers Down Under in its opening weekend, it ended up staying as the #1 film in North America for more than 3 months, right up until February of 91. 20th Century Fox predicted takings of between $70 and $80 million, somewhere in line with Uncle Buck, but Home Alone ended up making $285 million in the US and Canada alone. By the time it had made its way around the rest of the world's cinemas, that total had made its box office returns up to more than $475 million, over 25 times its production budget. Unbelievable stuff for what was typecast as a throwaway family comedy and became a profit-making machine. Hughes' germ of an idea, brought on from holiday paranoia, had created a monster. Home Alone succeeded in part because it managed to feel fresh in its presentation, whilst also taking clear influence from the likes of Chaplin and Keaton in the very impressive stunt work. Combining that with outstanding performers, ingenious for the time booby traps and contraptions, and in hindsight a really brilliant central performance from Culkin, this film was always destined to be a huge hit. As a kid, you think it's the coolest thing you've ever seen, but the craft behind the movie, from the practical effects action to the memorable John Williams score and the performances, make it just as rewarding for adults. Siskel and Ebert might not have liked Pesci and Stern as the wet bandits, but I thought they were great, as was Catherine O'Hara in particular as Kevin's mum Kate. Feels like one of those movies where all the stars aligned and it turned out as good as it ever possibly could have, even if you'd have made the thing 100 times over. After its mind-blowing success, Home Alone rapidly became a new template for how family films could be made. It also single-handedly turned Macaulay Culkin from a working child actor into a legitimate worldwide superstar. Award shows, music videos, Saturday Night Live, his own cartoon series, and yes, more hit films like 1991's My Girl, which raked in over $120 million on a $17 million budget. He became pretty much inescapable. Macaulay Culkin was now the hottest child star Hollywood had seen in decades, and it was all because of Home Alone. It also made making a sequel to Home Alone essentially inevitable, although with a heftier price tag.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
Thanks, Macaulay. I agree. Audience retention on YouTube is important. Anyway, By the time it was agreed that Home Alone 2 would go into production, both Hughes and Columbus kind of needed it to be a hit. The pair had reunited, along with Home Alone editor Roger Gosnell and John Candy, plus a Culkin cameo thrown in for the 1991 comedy Only the Lonely, which didn't hit with critics or audiences. In fact, Hughes' entire 1991 was filled with disappointments. He had written Career Opportunities, a vehicle for Labyrinth star Jennifer Connelly, and something of a return to the teen movie, but with elements of Home Alone thrown in for good measure, which ended up being such a messy production that he tried to take his name off the film before release, and which made just over $11 million in North American cinemas. Two more of his scripts, Dutch and Curly Sue, the latter of which he also directed, were not received well either, and also bombed at the box office. Hughes was becoming more disillusioned with Hollywood, despite, or maybe partly because of, the Home Alone success he was now attempting to live up to. "Suddenly I'm a commodity," he said at the time. "If Home Alone hadn't come out, my name wouldn't be on Career Opportunities 4 times." The script for Home Alone 2 Lost in New York had actually been finished by Hughes before the release of any of his 91 follow-up films, and would become part of a 6-film deal he had signed with Fox after the massive success of the first movie. Columbus would return, along with the key cast members, including Culkin, whose salary jumped from $100K to more than $4.5 million. Transplanting the story to New York City, but of course remaining at Christmas, Home Alone 2 would be criticised by some for its similarities to the first movie. The story beats are undeniably similar, with multiple obvious callbacks. The McAllister family are again due to spend Christmas on holiday, this time in Miami, and Kevin and his brother Buzz get into another fight, this time causing the school's entire Christmas choir to tumble. Kevin makes it to the airport this time, although through a series of unfortunate events, he gets on a plane to New York. With little more than his wits and his dad's credit card, he manages to check into the Plaza Hotel. Before long, the card is reported stolen, the family attempts to get to New York as quickly as possible, and Kevin runs into the Wet Bandits, who have escaped from prison. With Tim Curry, Rob Schneider, and the rest of the hotel staff on Kevin's case, he abandons the Plaza and ends up befriending the scary homeless pigeon lady in Central Park, played by Brenda Fricker, in much the same way as he had done with Roberts Blossom's neighbour Marley in Part 1. Having also befriended the owner of Duncan's Toy Chest, he decides to stop the bandits' planned robbery of the store on Christmas Eve by luring them to his uncle's townhouse, which is in the process of being renovated, and yes, chaos ensues. Filming began in December of 91 and ran through until May of 92, across New York, Chicago, and a Hollywood lot. As the movie was prepped for a November of 92 release date, it was clear that, if this was going to be another hit, it wouldn't be a sleeper one this time. Multiple video games, toys, board games, numerous brand tie-ins, Home Alone 2 was a blockbuster from the off. But it would arrive with less than perfect reviews. From noting that Hughes had merely moved his movie to a new locale and wrote a retread, wheeling out the well-worn precocious kid on his Todd scenario with scant regard for originality, to stating that Home Alone 2 pales next to its predecessor. Not all reviews were negative. Time magazine called it an uncynical sequel that actually deserves its assured success, but the critical classes didn't generally approve. With a considerable marketing campaign rolled out, Home Alone 2 arrived in North American cinemas on November 20th, 1992. Somewhat unsurprisingly, it landed at the top spot of the box office, although the sequel only managed 3 weeks there this time, eventually making more than $175 million domestically. Though this was a drop from Part 1, the worldwide gross of over $185 million was almost in line with the original and meant that the total cinema takings of over $359 million exceeded 75% of Home Alone 1's earnings. The measuring stick metric Hollywood used to analyze sequel success at the time. It was the third highest grossing film of 1992 at the worldwide box office, behind just Aladdin and The Bodyguard. Home Alone 2 might not be considered a classic by critics, even if it has been re-evaluated more positively in recent years, but it's a worthy sequel. One of the best ways to tackle a follow-up is to expand on what worked the first time around, and it does that effectively, whilst also delivering a darker tone. The move to New York mixes things up, and the return of the original cast, adding in some high-quality new additions, is vital to the overall package. It isn't perfect, and I can see why even now there is a fairly notable negative sentiment towards it from some quarters, but this is the movie business after all. For me, the quality of the players, both behind and in front of the cameras, carries it over the line. Watching the two films back again for this video, it struck me that another reason they are still so loved is that there are few modern examples breaking through in recent years to add to the list of Christmas movie greats. There have been some good ones, some not so good ones, and some huge budget franchise starters released this year which left me completely cold. In large part, Christmas films have either become cynical, almost AI-generated mega movies or factory-produced Hallmark filler, often dropped on a streaming platform and soon lost in a sea of content. Home Alone was a massive hit in cinemas because it was a fun, well-made movie. The fact that it was a film set at and entwined in Christmas has essentially made it an eternal part of pop culture. Sure, I get it. Times change, media habits change, the industry changes, but Christmas movies are forever, and it does feel like we've lost something pretty magical along the way when it comes to the Christmas film in the wake of all that change. Hello? Oh, hi boss. Yes, Merry Christmas to you too. Yeah, we're just in the middle of the Christmas episode now. Any notes? Right, try to be less of a Grinch and more positive about modern Christmas films. Okay, sure, will do. Christmas spirit and all that, boss. Looking forward to the office Christmas party later. Anything else I can help with? Oh wow, thank you. A Christmas present? That's really kind of you, boss. I wonder what it could be. Oh right, you bought me a Christmas jumper and I get to start work on the next Culture Slice video tomorrow morning as close to 7 AM as possible. That's very kind of you, boss. And you also want a Christmas and Christmas adjacent movie and TV show dance party montage ready for this video right now? Yes, boss, sure. No problem. And yes, I'll make sure I remind everyone to subscribe to Culture Slice if they like this kind of thing, and let them know that there is a huge amount to come from the channel over the next year and beyond. Consider it done, boss. Merry Christmas to you too. Son of a... Merry Christmas everyone, and now let's take a trip to 1997 as we get back to the story of what happened next for the Home Alone franchise. Buckle up, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. The impact of Home Alone on movies for younger viewers was considerable, and numerous imitators followed in its wake. Some made money, others didn't, but none could match its success, not even the ones that managed to have Macaulay Culkin as its lead. Of Home Alone's two creative heads, Chris Columbus would have more obvious initial success than John Hughes in the years that followed Lost in New York. whereas Columbus was directing Robin Williams to almost match Home Alone's box office numbers in 1993 with Mrs. Doubtfire, Hughes was writing and producing movies that clung more directly to the Home Alone formula, producing the likes of Dennis the Menace, which made money, and Baby's Day Out, which did not. It wasn't until 1996's live-action 101 Dalmatians movie for Disney that he was involved in a hit running anywhere close to Home Alone. By this stage, Hughes was also deep in production for a third Home Alone movie. He had originally planned for Home Alone 3 to be made at the same time as the second film, before the plans were tweaked with the intention that Culkin could return as a teenage Kevin to bridge the divide between films. This would soon prove impossible to deliver. After the Home Alones, Culkin had continued to star in movies for a few years, going against type in the poorly received psychological thriller The Good Son, before reverting back to comedy with Getting Even with Dad, and of course, starring as Richie Rich, before officially retiring from acting at the age of just 14 in 1994. Feeling overworked and exploited by his parents, he decided to live a more normal life and wouldn't be seen in the public eye much for years. Though he would return to acting in the early 2000s, his time as a major movie star was over. So without Culkin, Hughes needed another idea. Maybe just leaving Home Alone alone would have been the best option, but for whatever reason, they didn't let sleeping dogs lie. Hughes had initially considered bringing back not just Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern's Wet Bandits, but also Kieran Culkin, Macaulay's actual brother, as Kevin's cousin Fuller to take on the lead role. Reports indicate that the Bandits just weren't up for it, and that young Kieran ended up not wanting to take on the mantle of the role or the potential level of fame from his brother. But either way, this idea didn't go anywhere in the end.
Roman, do we cancel?
Instead, with Fox keen for another Home Alone movie in whatever form it took, Hughes concocted an entirely new story, without any of the original cast members and starring a brand new young actor in the lead role. And, though it was filmed over the winter, it wouldn't even be set at Christmas. Was nothing sacred by 1997? To replace Columbus, Hughes drafted in Raja Gosnell, editor of the first two movies, who had never directed a movie before. To replace Culkin, Alex D. Linz was cast as, yes, Alex. From here, the story goes somewhat off the deep end. Home Alone 3 featured a group of criminals working for an international terrorist group who hide a top-secret microchip in a toy car to get it through airport security and onto a flight, before it is accidentally taken by Alex's neighbour, played by Marion Seldes, who is heading back to Chicago. She ends up giving the toy to Alex as payment for shoveling her driveway. Alex gets chickenpox, is home alone due to his family being at work or school, and the criminals track down the neighborhood the microchip is in. When Alex realizes what is going on, he alerts the authorities, not once but twice unsuccessfully, before the bumbling mercenaries eventually clock on to Alex and he is forced to defend his home from the bad guys, just like Kevin did before him, though this time he does have the help of his pet rat Doris and a talking parrot.
Double or nothing.
Obviously. Filming for Home Alone 3 began in late 1996 and had been concluded before the end of March 1997. The criminals replacing Pesci and Stern this time were largely bit part actors, and the movie's biggest recognisable name to modern fans wouldn't actually become a star for 5 more years. A young Scarlett Johansson plays Alex's sister Molly. Despite not actually being set at Christmas, Fox decided that Home Alone 3 should still be released at Christmas, and the movie arrived in cinemas on December 12, 1997. Though anticipation for what most saw as a needless retread was hardly at fever pitch, not everyone disliked it. Roger Ebert revealed that he actually enjoyed it. To my astonishment, I like the third Home Alone movie better than the first two. I'm even going so far as to recommend it. Most other reviews weren't as kind. Gene Siskel called it a stupid slapstick piece of juvenilia and openly questioned if Ebert was feeling okay when he gave the film a thumbs up. Other analyses range from twice the bad guys, half the laughs, to whatever you may think Home Alone 3 is like, the reality is worse. When the movie opened in cinemas, audiences demonstrated their indifference to the brand continuing on. In its first weekend on release, Home Alone 3 placed in 4th place, behind another questionable John Hughes script, Flubber, though the Robin Williams movie proved to be a far more durable success at the worldwide box office. In the more cynical days of 1997, the postmodern likes of #1 movie of the week, Scream 2, made another Home Alone retread look like yesterday's news, which, if we're honest, it was. The movie would eventually make $30 million domestically, less than Scream 2 made in its opening weekend, against a $32 million budget. Worldwide box office took its takings to $79 million, a sharp decline from the glory days of the early 90s. In the end, for me, Home Alone 3 isn't necessarily a really terrible movie, but really it largely just doesn't have a reason to exist. Linz is pretty good in the lead role, but trying to follow Culkin is a totally thankless task, and the robbers in this one struggle to give the slapstick the heart achieved by Pesci and Stern. There are more elaborate contraptions and pratfalls, but it also feels pretty hollow and overtly ridiculous. Attempts to add more of a late 90s edge with international terrorist groups and D-list pop-punk soundtrack songs felt forced at the time and dates things far more now. It's definitely not unwatchable as sequels go, just kind of there. If you didn't know it, you'd expect it had been cobbled together by a writer for hire by the studio, but the fact that John Hughes is actually responsible for the story is just a bit surprising. Maybe he was just looking to run down the 5-picture deal he had with Fox at the time in the most straightforward way possible. Raja Gosnell has edited a lot of classic movies, but as a director, he went on to make the likes of Big Mama's House, Beverly Hills Chihuahua, and 2 films from both the Scooby-Doo and Smurfs franchises. He knows Home Alone, but he has also regularly appeared in worst directors ever lists for decades for a reason. Overall, that sheen of quality which had exuded from the screen in Part 1 especially is gone like dust in the wind. If Home Alone 3 was the only sequel made following the original 2 movies, it would have been a bit of a misguided folly. A pointless retread with a brand new cast which didn't do too much damage to the franchise's heritage, made a comparatively meagre amount of money, and would be largely forgotten. As it happened though, Home Alone 3 would, sadly, be just the beginning as we stumbled straight towards the new millennium. Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know? On today's show, the story of the late 90s secret Breakfast Club successor that nobody got the chance to see. Did you know that the last film written and produced by John Hughes made less than $5,000 in cinemas? Because in October of 1998, Hughes rolled back the clock with a screenplay called Reach the Rock, a low-budget drama made as part of a contractual obligation to deliver another movie for Universal Pictures. Always a good sign. Directed by debutante Bill Ryan, who had worked as Hughes' assistant on the first 2 Home Alones and would never direct a movie again, Reach the Rock would see Hughes explore a much darker tone than he had so far in the 1990s, telling the story of a man spending a night in a Shermer, Illinois jail years after his friend's death. Seen as a spiritual sequel to The Breakfast Club, possibly Hughes' most loved film in its tone, subject matter, and use of music, its lead character Robin, played by Alessandro Nivola, was viewed by many as a grown-up representation of Judd Nelson's John Bender. Hughes had also considered a direct Breakfast Club sequel exploring the characters' lives in their 30s, but this sadly never got close to production. Reach the Rock did make it in front of the cameras, and prior to its release, the marketing leaned heavily on Hughes' considerable back catalogue.
He's a filmmaker with style. He's an author with attitude. Now acclaimed filmmaker John Hughes makes a welcome return to his roots.
Unfortunately, Reach the Rock would be absolutely buried upon release by Universal, and what reviews there were generally negative. It made just $4,960 in cinemas when it was screened in just 3 different theaters across the entire United States, and is even now difficult to get hold of. It received a home video release the following year, but that sank without trace too. Though he would be credited with the script for 2001's Just Visiting, an adaptation of a French farce about medieval knights being transported to 21st century Chicago, that would be about the lot for Hughes' movie career. He was initially announced as the writer and director of a film called The Chambermaid starring Hilary Swank in the early 2000s, but this wouldn't end up coming to fruition. That project would eventually become Made in Manhattan, with the script changed so much that Hughes demanded he be credited under the pseudonym Edmond Dantes, the character who transforms into the Count of Monte Cristo. Hughes would be credited for the stories or characters of a number of films under the Dantes name, from Beethoven and its numerous straight-to-video or DVD sequels to Drillbit Taylor, despite invariably having very little to do with them. As for Reach the Rock, a YouTube search these days comes up with very little, and as far as we can tell, it isn't available on any streaming platforms. It remains the lost, forgotten John Hughes movie, and a strange footnote to a legendary career. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Make sure you join us next time on Did You Know? So yeah, parts 4 to 6 in the Home Alone cinematic universe. Only none of it was actually good enough to be released in cinemas. Over the course of a 20-year period, the Home Alone franchise ended up producing perhaps the steepest drop in quality a film series has ever seen. Harsh? Maybe, maybe not. You be the judge for yourself. For the rest of the films, there has been no Hughes, no Columbus, no Culkin. Buzz turns up as a cop in part 6, but that's about it in terms of the old world. It's been wall-to-wall Christmas chaos, and not in a good way. Things started really unraveling 5 years after the meh reaction to Home Alone 3, when Home Alone 4 Taking Back the House became the brand's first made-for-TV movie. The idea for the fourth film had initially been to make a sequel to Part 3, but this eventually changed to being another movie about Kevin McAllister and his family, kind of. Chris Columbus was by this point in charge of the multi-billion-dollar Harry Potter films, John Hughes had detached from the industry, and though Macaulay Culkin had returned to some acting roles, Home Alone 4 was not on his radar. The characters are the same, their ages are the same, but this is a completely new cast. They even bring back Wet Bandit Marv, who is still a criminal but now has his wife Vera along for the ride. The producers apparently wanted Daniel Stern to return himself, but when he read the script, he's reported to have called it an insult to the original series. Needless to say, he didn't accept the job. You can see the general direction of travel here. The fourth installment was shot in early 2002 in Cape Town, South Africa, for budgeting reasons, though it is still ostensibly set in Chicago. The replacement Kevin, played by Mike Weinberg, is dealing with the imminent divorce of his parents and spending Christmas at his dad's rich girlfriend's house. Kevin intercepts a plan by Marv, now played by Third Rock from the Sun star French Stewart, and his wife to rob the mansion, and we are once again off to the wacky races. Home Alone 4 Taking Back the House premiered in November of 2002 on ABC as the first episode of a new season of The Wonderful World of Disney. The producers, almost unbelievably, had hoped that its success would create the opportunity for a Home Alone TV series, going so far as agreeing deals with its main cast to appear. However, it underperformed in the ratings, reviews were savage, and the whole endeavour came to an abrupt halt. Home Alone 4 is so unspeakably bad that it's hard to believe it exists at times. It feels like a parody of a terrible sequel, or one of those knockoff DVD fakes of hit films. It's mind-boggling to think that it is in fact made by Fox. And yes, it's a TV movie, and yes, it's aimed at kids, but it's hard to contemplate how this could actually be worse or bring enjoyment to anyone. The thing is, there are some decent actors here. Jason Baig is a solid hand, and Missy Pyle seems to have been in literally everything. But the script, from TV writers Deborah Frank and Steve L. Hayes, just cannot be saved. Combined with the very low rent production values and charmless delivery, this ranks as a low point for my time on Sequelpalooza so far. It is simply a painful experience for the robbers and for us. By all rights, this should definitely have drawn a line under the franchise as a going concern, but of course it didn't. It would lay dormant for a while, but like any number of movie monsters throughout film history, it would eventually rise from the ashes to leave in its wake destruction and pain. Or something. It goes without saying that Home Alone 4 had destroyed any possibility of a cinematic return or seemingly a TV series, but the brand was still considered valuable enough for a one-off TV movie at this stage, so Home Alone: The Holiday Heist went into production in the spring of 2012. The story of Home Alone 5 ditched the McAllisters, instead revolving around Finn Baxter and his sister Alexis, Christian Martin, and Jodelle Furlan. Two technology-obsessed kids whose parents are stuck at a Christmas party in a snowstorm as a group of art thieves, led by Malcolm McDowell and Debbie Mazar, attempt to break into their new home. You see, unbeknownst to Finn's family, there is a long-lost Edvard Munch painting stored away somewhere in the house worth $85 million. And once again, we are up for booby traps, stunt work, and morality lessons, though this time there are more technologically advanced plot devices, and the movie is not set in Chicago. Home Alone: The Holiday Heist made its broadcast debut in November 2012 and was released on DVD a year later.
This is totally cool.
A world premiere movie event.
It was rolled out to little fanfare and poor reviews, and you can absolutely see why. The movie fails to move the franchise forward in any meaningful way, none of the characters are particularly interesting, and the subplots around the family dynamic, the house being potentially haunted, and the setup of the robbers' motives are interminably dull. Talented actors are again wasted, floundering around in this nonsense. Though calculating profitability on a TV movie like this is difficult, Home Alone 5 reportedly cost $11 million to make and raked in an estimated $1 million in DVD sales. You really do have to wonder what the point of the whole exercise was. Moving forward almost a decade, by 2021, the media world around the Home Alone franchise had seen drastic change. Streaming was increasingly the dominant force in visual media consumption, and Disney had not only bought Fox, but launched Disney Plus, its very own streaming service. And what they needed was content. A lot of content. In this climate, making another Home Alone movie was unsurprising. Unneeded, but unsurprising. The fact that it became the first Fox production to be made exclusively for Disney Plus brought a strange sense of synergy to proceedings, with one of the most important titles from Fox's recent history now being used as a tentpole release for its new owner's attempt at creating a future-proofed platform. That doesn't mean that it was a good idea, of course, but it was, unquestionably, an idea. Anyway, Home Sweet Home Alone went into production not long after Disney had acquired Fox. Early rumours indicated that Macaulay Culkin might actually return in some form, but Culkin himself soon squashed that possibility. The script for Home Sweet Home Alone from Streeter Seidel, better known as the head writer of Saturday Night Live and SNL cast member Mike Day, also known as the Is It Cake guy, attempts to both stick closely to and tweak the by now far too well-trodden story. A young boy named Max, played by Archie Yates, is left behind in an insanely kitted out house when his family goes on holiday to Japan without him, to his delight at first. As he begins to realise he misses his family more than he thought he would, he also defends his house from a married couple, Rob Delaney and Ellie Kemper, who are desperate to retrieve a valuable doll that they incorrectly believe Max has stolen, so that they have a chance to sell it and keep their family home. In part due to the prestige of its Disney Plus prominence at the time, along with the nostalgia of the passing of the 30th anniversary of the original film's release, it felt like Home Sweet Home Alone was the most anticipated of the later trio of attempted reboots when it arrived in November 2021.
Sweet Home Alone.
Sadly though, reviews were once again largely negative, lamenting it as an unnecessary sequel that fails to revive the franchise, that doesn't commit hard enough to be silly fun, with something rotten at the core. As the New York Times review put it, who's the real victim here? The audience. Buzz McAllister's cameo doesn't offer much. There's a few comedians I recognise from much funnier shows. The film isn't great. The script manages to make its main star an entirely unsympathetic character. The early scenes are often awkward. The story is nonsensical in the extreme. And the violence here feels much more painful and off-putting than slapstick. But given some of the people involved, Home Sweet Home Alone does feature very occasional, intermittent flickers of quality. The end result, though, is far from appealing. It might also feel like it's not as hopeless a movie as something like Home Alone 4, because the production values are superior, but wait, no, actually, it just is better than Home Alone 4. I'll give the movie that. Although if that is the level of expectation here, then the bar has fallen so low that there seemingly is no bottom. Home Sweet Home Alone has not, so far, instigated a rush for more to come from the franchise. Thankfully. Given that we're seeing a reboot every decade at the current trajectory, Home Alone will undoubtedly reappear someday, whether we like it or not. The thing is, the director of Home Alone 4 made Teen Wolf and K9. The director of Home Alone 5 made Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. The director of Home Alone 6 co-wrote Sacha Baron Cohen's best work. They were all capable of so much more. They also have some talented actors to work with, especially in the strange assortment of recognisable faces who make up the various robbers over the films. But for whatever reason, they certainly couldn't deliver much of value here. I know these are TV films, and I'm probably going off the deep end a little after watching 10 hours of Home Alone in a short space of time, but surely we could have got something more than these endless Groundhog Day wasteland retreads sullying the good name of a classic. Did they have to be this bad? It's no wonder that Rod Daniel retired from the industry after the painful process of making Home Alone 4. As Chris Columbus put it prior to the sixth film's release, "What's the point? I'm a firm believer that you don't remake films that have had the longevity of Home Alone. You're not going to create lightning in a bottle again. It's been done. Do your own thing. Even if you fail miserably, at least you have come up with something original." Watching all these sequels, it reiterates that it is really tough to be genuinely charming, funny, and believable in a role like Kevin McAllister and in a movie like Home Alone. It took expert precision in the script writing and delivery from the filmmakers and a deft performance well beyond his years for Macaulay Culkin to pull it off. And sadly, none of the teams who have followed in their wake managed to come close. They really shouldn't have bothered. It's probably no secret by now that John Hughes' work is really special to me, but before making this video, I'd somewhat neglected attempting to articulate quite why. I think it's perhaps that there has never been a filmmaker or screenwriter who so effectively presented stories of and characters in movies about younger people that was so believable and relatable. As their presence coincided with my own adolescence, those stories have stayed with me. They will always have a place in my heart as long as I live. Home Alone and Home Alone 2 work so well because they are not patronizing. They treat the younger cast members and their equivalent audience as equals. Hughes noted that he actively attempted to see the world from the viewpoint of Kevin, not simply tell a story with him in it. That tonal shift had a profound effect on the way Hollywood presented movies for those audiences going forward, and helps to make the first two films so memorable, but nobody has ever quite managed to live up to the same magic, even if they've followed the formula. John Hughes really was a one-off. When it came to Home Alone, combining Hughes' writing with the deft touch of Chris Columbus, a mainstream director who doesn't get enough recognition for his overall body of work, along with a stellar cast and the timeless John Williams score, and with Home Alone, you had a really formidable combination. It is, for a family film, about as good as it gets. Of the two, Columbus's post-Home Alone career saw considerable peaks, whilst for John Hughes, it represented a watermark after which he wouldn't deliver nearly the same level of impact ever again. I guess everyone has a peak period which cannot last forever, but it's still pretty crazy to me how far he fell off. Clearly, for whatever reason, a malaise had set in, and that malaise is encapsulated in the output of Home Alone 3. He had created a formula and, either through personal choice or, more likely, a financially driven imperative from the studio, stuck to it. Some of the movies he wrote and produced in the mid to late 90s made a bit of money, but the magic was gone. This episode has been something of a diversion for Sequelpalooza, as, so far, we've been covering movie franchises in which the sequels fall apart in fairly rapid order. When it comes to Home Alone, the sequel actually worked pretty spectacularly well. Sure, reviews at the time were middling, and it isn't quite as beloved as the original, but it has still become a Christmas classic, and it made a big splash at the box office, before becoming a fairly permanent fixture for Christmas home video and TV viewing. There are even those who, whisper it, actually prefer the second installment to the first. For us here at Culture Slice Towers, this is breaking new ground. A successful sequel, you say? The problems for this film brand, of course, came when they decided to continue the story beyond Lost in New York. Because let's be honest, Home Alone as a concept worked well for the first film, and the second survived the sequel curse by mixing it up enough and bringing back the brilliant cast. Beyond that, the idea had really run its course. Literally nothing more needed to be said on the matter, especially without the original players. Although if you were a kid growing up when Home Alone 3 arrived in the world, you may slightly disagree. Probably the best piece of media the series has produced since 1992, doesn't last longer than a minute, but it does feature Macaulay Culkin. The 2018 Google Assistant advert, in which an adult Kevin recreates scenes from the film with help from modern technology, was the most legitimately funny thing I saw as I trawled through Home Alone's more recent history.
What do I owe you? Looks like you paid online.
Keep the change, you filthy animal.
Okay, cool.
Maybe the later sequels could have actually proved some worth by featuring well thought through concepts rather than just lazy tribute acts. But alas, that didn't end up being the case, as what we've actually seen is churned out TV movie filler. It's been quite the fall from grace. Clearly things took a dive creatively, but when you look at it from a financial perspective, who it all went really wrong for was Warner Brothers. By refusing to cough up little more than an extra $1 million to get the first film made, they essentially hand-delivered a $1 billion franchise over to Fox, one which will be bringing in Christmas residual income for as long as people celebrate the season. In the litany of unforced errors made by film studios, I'd say this one is a pretty undervalued and high-ranking case. People talk about how writing a Christmas hit is the best pension a musician can ever invest in, but that Home Alone Christmas revenue isn't anything to be balked at either. As Raja Gosnell, editor of the first two movies and director of the third, noted a few years back, the fact that it still comes around every year feels good. It's like having that favourite dish you only cook once a year around the holidays. If you could watch it every week, you wouldn't. But you watch Home Alone, and it feels good to be back. You know what to expect, yet it still delivers. Whatever happens with the streaming wars in the future, or if linear TV really does eventually perish, and through whatever technology people end up transmitting films to their living rooms, there's likely to never be a time that Home Alone won't be present in homes every December. A Christmas tradition that people actually enjoy. A monument of a Hollywood era long gone, a time when mid-range family comedies becoming the highest grossing films of the year and genuine cultural moments wasn't a thing of the past. If Hollywood could start producing more Home Alones and fewer Red Ones, that would be a Christmas gift that would be gratefully received, thank you very much. Let's just hope that there aren't too many more dodgy reboots being prepared to join them over the coming decades as well. Oh, hello, you're still here.
Where do you think you're going? Nobody's leaving.
Okay, thanks Clark. Anyway, you're allowed to leave, but thanks for watching the video. You've made it all the way to the outro. If you want to check out the rest of the Sequelpalooza story so far, then this video here is a 2-hour compilation of the first 3 episodes, featuring deep dives into the cinematic journeys of a trio of 80s classics and their not so admired sequels, The Never-Ending Story, Caddyshack, and Teen Wolf. There's a whole load more to come soon from Culture Slice, but in the meantime, Merry Christmas if you are watching this at Christmas, and remember, we're all in this together.
We're all in this together.
Thanks Clark, I've already said that part.
This is a full-blown 4-alarm holiday emergency here.
Oh right, better get more booze in then guys.
We're gonna press on, and we're gonna have the happiest Christmas since Bing Crosby tap danced with Danny Kaye.
Thanks for watching everybody.